Chapter 1. The Phantom Light on the Thames. It was in the last week of October, in the year 89, that I once more found myself installed at Baker Street, sharing with my old companion those curious interludes of silence and excitement which alternated in the life of Sherlock Holmes. The autumn had come early that year, and with it the city had taken on a mood of desolate melancholy. A persistent drizzle clung to the windows, the pavements gleamed like oiled leather, and the gas lamps burned with that dull orange flicker, which seems to make shadows more menacing than darkness itself. Holmes sat before the fire, a long thin wisp of smoke curling from the Turkish cigarette between his fingers. Upon the mantelpiece lay a litter of chemical apparatus, glass retorts, tiny blowpipes, and a narrow-necked flask from which came a faint acrid odor. He had been engaged all morning upon some obscure experiment involving terre derivatives, and the room reeked of it. I had been reading idly through the Times when a small paragraph in the lower column arrested my attention. It ran as follows: Mysterious occurrence on the river. Late on Wednesday evening, a light was observed moving erratically upon the waters near Deadman's Wharf limehouse. A watchman hurrying to the spot discovered an abandoned barge drifting with the tide. Within it lay the body of a man, identity unknown, whose throat had been cut with a seaman's knife. No money or papers were found upon him. The police are investigating. I read the notice aloud. Holmes made no movement, but the merest flicker of amusement passed over his face. "Deadman's Wharf, Watson," he murmured. "A poet could hardly have selected a more felicitous address for murder. You think it was murder, then?" "My dear fellow," said he, rising and throwing the cigarette into the grate, "the river seldom yields corpses that have slit their own throats. No, someone wished this poor devil to vanish quietly beneath the tide. But the river is a treacherous accomplice. It gives back more than it keeps." He stood before the fire, the lean figure outlined sharply against the glow, and for a long moment his grey eyes were distant and abstracted. Then, with that sudden energy so characteristic of him, he seized his violin from the side table and drew from it a low, haunting note. "The Thames, Watson. Ah, what a witness she would make if she could but speak. 1,000 crimes whisper beneath her waters. Tell me, have you any engagement for the afternoon?" "None," said I. "Excellent. Then you shall accompany me to the wharf. There is a certain Inspector Lestrade who, at this moment, is convincing himself that the case is closed. I should like to see how wrong he is." The fog hung thick upon the embankment when we drove eastward in a hansom, the horses' hoofs striking sharp echoes on the stones. As we passed the tower, the river widened into a grey oblivion, only here and there, disturbed by the sluggish pulse of a tug or the distant clang of a buoy. Limehouse lay ahead, a district of sullen warehouses, gin shops, and the queer mingling of faces that mark the edges of empire. Chinese sailors, lascars, and rough English stevedores jostled one another in the narrow alleys. We found Deadman's Wharf at the end of a crooked lane leading down to the water. A pair of constables stood guard before a low shed, their boots coated in river mud. Beyond them, the wharf itself stretched into the fog like the deck of a ghostly ship. A faint glimmer, perhaps the very phantom light of the newspaper paragraph, trembled somewhere out upon the tide. Lestrade, short and brisk as ever, greeted us with a mixture of irritation and relief. "Good afternoon, Mr. Holmes. I might have known you'd turn up. You've read the papers, no doubt?" "Indeed," Holmes replied. "A singular case. You have the body?" "In here." Lestrade lifted the latch of the shed. "Poor chap's a seaman, judging by the calluses. Knife wound, clean and deep. No signs of a struggle." Holmes bent over the body, his face expressionless. The dead man was powerfully built, his hands roughened and tar-stained. A tattoo, an anchor entwined with a serpent, marked his left forearm. His coat was of coarse serge, damp and heavy with river water. Holmes examined the wound, then the man's boots, then the lining of the coat pockets. Finally, he picked a small fragment from beneath one fingernail, a glinting speck no larger than a grain of sand. He held it to the light, smiled faintly, and secreted it within his glove. Nothing missing, you say? Nothing but his life, Lestrade muttered. We've dragged the river for belongings. No bag, no hat, no weapon. Just that cursed lantern, swinging on the barge like a lure. Holmes turned sharply. Lantern? Aye. Found it burning, half drowned in the bilge water. No oil left, yet it was lit, or so the watchman swears. Holmes regarded the inspector keenly. And the watchman? Name of Blake. Reliable fellow. Keeps the wharf at night. Says he saw the light moving, called out, and when no one answered, went down to investigate. Claims the barge was drifting free. Holmes tapped his fingers against the wall, absorbed. Curious. The tide would have been ebbing. To drift upstream against it suggests deliberate motion. Upstream! Lestrade exclaimed, but that's impossible. Nothing is impossible, said Holmes, only improbable until examined. He stepped out of the shed and walked toward the water's edge. The fog swirled around him like a living thing, and for a moment he vanished entirely. Then his voice came low and measured. Watson, note the ropes. 2 sets of marks. One where the barge was tied, and another where something else was moored beside it. A smaller vessel, perhaps. And here, see the indentation in the mud? The heel of a boot, narrow and foreign-made. You mean someone came ashore? Someone. And recently. Look how the water has not yet filled the print. Lestrade snorted. You can make a romance out of a puddle, Mr. Holmes. Holmes straightened, that sardonic smile flickering again. A romance, perhaps, but one written in mud, blood, and oil. Tell me, Inspector, did your men find a scrap of blue silk? No. Then they looked too hastily. Come, Watson. He strode along the wharf, stooping now and again to examine the planks. At one point he paused, lifted something with his forceps, and placed it carefully in his pocketbook. I glimpsed a torn fragment of cloth, damp but unmistakably blue. As we made our way back toward the waiting cab, I ventured to speak. You suspect foul play beyond robbery, Holmes? I suspect, said he quietly, that we are standing at the edge of a design as intricate as any I have seen. There is purpose here, cold, deliberate purpose. That lantern was not merely to lure attention, it was to mark something. Mark what? He smiled enigmatically. That, my dear Watson, is what we shall discover, before the river tells it first. The fog thickened, swallowing the wharf entirely. Only the sound of the lapping water remained, and somewhere in that vast, unseen expanse, I fancied I saw again a faint light drifting, a solitary lantern upon the black current, as if mocking our pursuit. End of chapter. Would you like me to continue with chapter 2? The client from Limehouse following directly from this point, keeping the same tone, depth, and 1,000+ word structure. Sherlock Holmes and the Lantern on Deadman's Wharf. Chapter 2. The client from Limehouse. On the following morning I found Holmes in one of those alert and almost feline humors which presaged either the commencement or the imminent fruition of a case. He had breakfasted lightly, coffee and a single slice of toast, yet his eyes were bright and his movements possessed that quick precision I had seen when his mind ran on some fine, invisible scent. Pray do not trample those grains, Watson, said he as I entered with the day's post. He indicated the hearth rug, whereupon a careful sprinkling of pale dust lay as regular as if sifted through a sieve. I hardly think your rug is improved by it, I remarked. It is not the rug I am embellishing, but a theory, he returned, stooping to examine the dust with his lens. The draught that enters from the window by Mrs. Hudson's stair is not, as she supposes, to be cured by stuffing wool in the sash. Observe the drift, east to west in the morning, west to east at night. Curious, is it not? Most curious. You have risen early to test your theory of draughts? Not entirely, he said with the ghost of a smile. The river air has been in my head. Besides, I have had time to peruse your medical journal. The author of the paper on obscure throat lesions writes from the address of a hairdresser's in St. Pancras. The scissors and the scalpel are far cousins. Alas, the paper's reasoning bears the stamp of the former. Before I could reply, he had crossed to the table where I had laid the letters. Without reading the superscriptions, he ran a finger lightly across one envelope and brought it to his nose. "Sea fog and gin," he murmured. "This one is for us." He handed it to me. The postmark was Limehouse, and within, upon a sheet lined in cheap blue, was scrawled a trembling message. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes. I keep the watch at Deadman's Wharf. They say I am to hold my tongue and leave things to the yard, but I cannot. There is more to that lantern than any of them will see. I beg you, sir, for the sake of a Christian man put out like a gutted candle, to grant me a hearing. I will come at 11. Your obedient servant, Samuel Blake." "The watchman," said I. "Lestrade's witness." Holmes nodded. 11 o'clock will be both convenient and instructive. In the meanwhile, you have been to your surgery in Kensington this morning." "I have not," said I, surprised. "No? The mud on your sole has the mica sheen of Prince's Muse. The only occasion on which you collect that particular glimmer is when you visit the apothecary adjacent to your former practice. Yet you disclaim it. Hence the mud is not yours. Lend me your umbrella." I obeyed in some perplexity. Holmes examined the ferrule. "Exactly. Mrs. Hudson's nephew, an errand boy of 17 with a weakness for peppermint, used this to prod at a grating where the Muse grease collects. There is the scent, there the mica. He left the umbrella in the hall, you took it up, and thus I am again justified of my egotism." "My dear Holmes," I protested, laughing, "no other man would discover a boy's peppermint in a gentleman's umbrella." "Other men do not live upon crumbs," he answered. "It is a poor breakfast that despises crumbs." At the stroke of 11 there came a cautious step upon the landing, and Mrs. Hudson ushered in a gaunt man of middle years, with wind-seamed cheeks, a troubled, honest eye, and the peculiar stoop of one who has spent his life listening for distant sounds. He clutched a cloth-wrapped object close to his chest. "Mr. Holmes," he ventured. "Pray be seated, Mr. Blake," said Holmes cordially. "The river fog sits on you yet. You have come by tram and on foot, and you have not broken your fast." The man started, then gave a nervous half-smile which showed a missing tooth. "It's all true, sir. I couldn't keep a mouthful down after what I seen." Holmes waved him to the fire and pushed toward him a cup of coffee. "You wrote of a lantern." Blake loosened the cloth. Within lay the upper portion of a ship lantern, its brasswork dented, and its glass chimney fractured, as if by immersion and some rough handling after. It exhaled a faint odor, oily but with a sweet, acrid ghost that pricked the back of the throat. "I took the liberty," Blake said, glancing toward the door, "of keeping this bit back when the constables had done with it. There was talk of throwing it with the rest of the rubbish. I couldn't abide that. There's something wrong with this light, sirs. I know lights." "You did perfectly right," Holmes replied, and the quick, appreciative gleam in his eyes showed how rare he found such allies. He took the broken lantern, sniffed delicately, and with a pair of forceps withdrew from the socket a charred thread of wick. "Colza oil, but adulterated," he murmured. "Yes, very much adulterated." "With what, sir?" asked Blake. Holmes's lip twitched. "We shall come to that. Tell us, in your own words, what occurred." Blake set the cup aside and folded his rough hands. "I'm at the wharf from dusk to dawn, Mr. Holmes. Been so these 6 years. We keep our bales and barrels, watch for pilferers. There's plenty, and give a call when a lighter is due to tie up. Wednesday night the fog was thick as hog's breath. At about 11:15 I see, leastways I think I see, a light hanging low upon the water, not steady-like, but drifting. I calls, 'Ahoy there!' No answer. I takes my stick and goes down the steps. The tide was on the ebb. The barge comes scumming along slow as if a hand were on it, though there was no one to see. And there in the bilge I finds the poor chap with his throat cut. God save us." "You have seen him before?" asked Holmes in that gentle tone he could command when he pleased. Blake hesitated. "Not to swear to it, sir, but there's a lighterman as comes sometimes. Broad across the chest, hair like tow, serpent and anchor upon the left forearm. Much the same as this one, begging your pardon. And there's been queer comings and goings of late at the next wharf along, Mortlake's Lease they call it. Crates shifted after midnight, a small boat moored where there's no right to moor. I've told Mr. Hartley, he's the agent for our place, but he says to hold my tongue and mind my lantern. Holmes's eyes narrowed a fraction. Mortlake's Lease. And Mr. Hartley discourages your curiosity. Why bring the lantern to me against his orders? Blake's Adam's apple bobbed. Because Mr. Hartley went white as a sheet when he smelt it. He said it was only some foreign oil. Cheap stuff, he says. But I know a river light, Mr. Holmes, and this one bites the nose. I thought, well, sir, I thought you'd know. Mr. Blake, said Holmes, you are a credit to the St. Catherine docks. You shall not regret your insubordination. Who besides the yard knows of the lantern's condition? No one, sir. I wrapped it and carried it home beneath my coat. The missus don't ask questions when the river's in my clothes. Holmes rose, set the lantern upon the table, and touched the fractured glass with a long forefinger. Watson, he said, a card and pencil. He scribbled half a dozen lines, sealed them, and addressed the envelope. Be so good as to send this by the next district messenger to Scotland Yard. Lestrade, in particular. We shall require access to the barge once more. As I rang for Billy to run the errand, Blake's eyes went from Holmes to me and back again with a desperate trust which moved me more than his words. You'll look into it, gentlemen. I'd not have the river blamed for what men have done. We shall look into it to the bottom, Holmes answered. A few questions, if you please. On Wednesday, before you saw the light, did you hear any bell? No matter how faint. The watchman frowned. A bell, sir? There's the buoy downriver, but that was quiet. Once, now you put it to me, I thought I heard a small tinkle, like the bell on a handcart, but it might have been fancy. Holmes steepled his fingers. Not fancy. And the boat which you suspect moored where it had no right. Describe her. A narrow thing, Mr. Holmes. Low to the water, painted dark, no name on the stern as I could see, rowlocks wrapped with cloth, silent. Holmes nodded as if a piece of a map in his mind had received its contour. That will do admirably. Now, Mr. Blake, you will go home by another route than the one you came, and you will speak to no one of your visit. If any man questions you, you will remark upon the cheapness of cod this season, and leave him to wonder at your intelligence. Good day. When the door had closed upon our visitor, Holmes remained a long minute motionless, his face turned neither to me nor to the fire, but to that point in the middle distance where, I am convinced, his mind arranged its pieces. Then he sprang up, took the lantern to the window, and with a penknife scraped lightly at the rim of the chimney. A fine blue dust fell upon a sheet of paper. He folded it without a word and placed it in an envelope, which he labelled with the date and the word Limehouse. You are collecting colours, Holmes, I observed. A speck beneath the dead man's nail yesterday, a scrap of silk on the wharf, now this blue powder. To what rainbow do these lead? To a lantern that burns where it should not, he returned, with that dry brevity which showed I had come within an inch of the line he would not cross. Fetch your coat, Watson. We shall pay Mr. Hartley a call before luncheon. We obtained a cab and turned again toward the river. The day had cleared somewhat, showing London's long soot-coloured flank with more honesty than kindness. The tower looked stern and surprised, as if it had awakened to find itself in a city of iron rails and cash-books. By the time we reached the narrow thoroughfares of Limehouse, the traffic had thickened with carts of tea and sacks of rice, with sailors' curses and the cries of hawkers shrilling like gulls. I confess there is always in me a mingled attraction and repugnance toward that district, attraction for its variety and vital colour, repugnance for the human wreckage, and the reek that clings to the bricks. Mr. Percival Hartley, shipping agent, kept a tidy office at the head of Deadman's Wharf, an incongruity, as an oasis is an incongruity in a desert. He was a pale gentleman of some 35 years, with neatly parted hair and the cool hands of a bookkeeper. A gilt-lettered board behind him proclaimed connections with several firms whose names were as far-flung as the Empire. "To what do I owe the honor, Mr. Holmes?" he asked, with a polite composure which I liked the less the longer I observed it. Inspector Lestrade gave me to understand that the matter was in his hands. "The matter of a dead lighterman adrift beneath your windows?" Holmes returned, taking a chair. "It is a river's matter, Mr. Hartley. And where there is a river, there are 1,000 hands. You keep excellent ledgers. Do you keep an excellent night?" Hartley's eyes flickered. "I sleep at home, Mr. Holmes, as civilized men do." "And yet you advise your watchman to silence." "Blake is an honest fellow, but with a tongue too free for speculation. The sight of blood sets the most practical minds to weaving horrors. I would not have the reputation of the Wharf injured by tales." Holmes crossed one leg over the other and surveyed the man with languid interest. "Reputation is a delicate thing. It takes a lifetime to cultivate and a single lantern to spoil." "You refer to the light upon the barge." Hartley's tone remained colourless. "A sorry business, as I trust the police will discover the murderer." "They will try," said Holmes. "My friend the doctor and I shall assist them. Tell me, Mr. Hartley, why should a lantern be burning on a barge with no man to tend it and no oil to feed it?" The agent's fingers made a small restless movement upon the desk. "I cannot imagine." "Then permit me to imagine for you. Suppose a lantern, prearranged, is kindled by a wick prepared in such manner that it will burn bright for a little while and then of a sudden die. Suppose that light to serve as a signal to someone watching across the water. The light burns. He stirs. The business is accomplished. The light dies. Would not that be a pretty contrivance for men who prefer not to whistle in the dark?" Hartley smiled with his lips, but not with his eyes. "Your gift for romance, Mr. Holmes, is no doubt what has made your name. But we are practical here. We ship goods and receive them. We do not flash lanterns across the Thames like schoolboys on Guy Fawkes's night." Holmes glanced idly toward a shelf where sample oils and stoppered bottles stood in a neat row. "Your commerce includes oils?" "We handle what is consigned to us," Hartley answered. "Tea, spices, lamp oils, the ordinary colonial trade." "Tea, spices, lamp oils," Holmes repeated, thoughtfully. "You employ a chemist to examine adulterations?" "We rely upon our correspondents and the customs men." Holmes rose with a bored yawn which I, who knew him, recognized as the sign of a mind that has gathered what it came for. "Then you will not object if we ask Lestrade to examine your books for Wednesday night, the names of lighters tied up at your wharf and at Mortlake's lease, and the list of shipments consigned under your responsibility." Hartley's pallor deepened. "If the police require, Mr. Holmes, they shall have what is their due." "Excellent," said Holmes, and made for the door. "One further trifle. Have you lost recently a scrap of blue silk, narrow, strong, of a shade between indigo and lapis?" Hartley's surprise was too perfect to be genuine. "Blue silk? Certainly not." "Then I must have dreamed it," Holmes returned, and bowed us out. We walked once the length of the wharf, where the river slapped the piles with its hollow hands. The shed where the body had lain was fastened and guarded, the constables dozing with that admirable alertness which is the special gift of their class. Holmes stood looking down at the water a long time, as if waiting for it to speak. The sky had taken on that pewter hue which precedes a fall of evening, and a single gull wheeled and cried like a small lost soul. "You think Hartley knows more than he will say?" I ventured. "I think," Holmes answered slowly, "that Mr. Hartley is a gentleman who keeps an excellent night." "His words were to the contrary." "His words are a screen," said Holmes. "There is a habit some men acquire, of answering the question that should have been asked. He is of that kidney." "And the lantern?" "The lantern," said Holmes, "was prepared. Its burning time was calculated. Its odor was concealed beneath another odor familiar to the river. Its color—" He broke off with an impatient shake of the head. "I am not yet ready to speak with confidence. When a thing is not clear to me, I prefer to keep my tongue. It is a practice which would improve many reputations." We had reached the head of the steps when there came hurrying toward us a young woman with a shawl about her shoulders and eyes that shone with fear and resolution. She looked from my companion to the wharf and back again, as if choosing between the devil, the deep sea, and a last hope. "Mr. Holmes?" she gasped. He raised his hat. "At your service." "I am Hannah Corbett, sir. Hannah Corbett of Shadwell. My brother Tom Corbett. He went out Wednesday in a borrowed coat, and he never came home. They say there was a body found. Oh, God forgive me, but the tattoo—" She broke upon the word. Holmes's hard face softened in that rare way which increased his power rather than diminished it. "Courage, Miss Corbett," said he. "We shall not deal in rumors. Did your brother bear an anchor and serpent on the left forearm?" "He did, sir," she whispered, "from his years on the river, and he had a scar by the temple here from a fall as a boy." Holmes took a small notebook from his pocket. "When did you last see him?" "Wednesday afternoon, going toward Limehouse Reach. He had a little packet with him, a folded thing, tied with blue ribbon. He said he was to meet a gentleman after dark, and there would be money if he kept his word. We have been hard-pressed, sir, since Mother died." "A folded thing, tied with blue ribbon," Holmes repeated, as if the words were a line of music. "Did he say where he would meet this gentleman?" "At a place called Mortlake's Lease, sir." "Thank you, Miss Corbett. You have been brave to come. You will return home by way of Ratcliffe Highway, and you will keep your door bolted. If any person asks whether your brother's coat was borrowed, you will say that it was not, and then you will say nothing further." She stared at him, startled. "But it was borrowed." "From Mr. Jonas Pike, who keeps a stall by the docks." "Why must I—" "Because," Holmes said, and now his voice was very grave, "truth is the choicest meat, and there are wolves about. Will you do as I ask?" "Yes, sir," she whispered. He touched his hat again, and the girl hurried away as quickly as decorum allowed. We stood for a moment watching her vanish among the bales and barrels. "You saw it, Watson?" said Holmes softly. "Saw what?" "The ribbon," he replied. "Or rather the memory of a ribbon. A blue band to bind a packet, a blue silk to bind a wick, a blue powder to bind a flare. When a color repeats, it is not a fashion but a language. And what does this language say? That," said he with a sudden animation, "is what we shall entice it to confess. Come, we have an appointment with a certain man who does not keep an excellent night. If he is at home after dark, I shall be much surprised." "And who is that?" "Mr. Jonas Pike," Holmes answered, and the name dropped from his lips like a pebble into deep water, leaving only widening rings. "Stall-keeper, lender of coats, and, if I do not much mistake, broker of lanterns." He hailed a passing cab. As we climbed in, the wind shifted, bringing with it from downriver a faint, unmistakable sound. A single, delicate tinkle, like the strike of a glass bead in a saucer. Holmes leaned forward at once, his eyes kindled. "Hark, Watson! The bell that is not a bell. The river is speaking." He rapped on the roof. "To Shadwell. And driver, be liberal of your whip, for we hunt a light that walks." The cab jerked forward into the grey and noise, and as we rattled away I had the queer impression that the city itself, with its lanes and cranes and countless windows, was a vast blind face turned toward the river, listening as we were, for that small, unearthly chime. Sherlock Holmes and the Lantern on Deadman's Wharf. Chapter 3. Shadows at Shadwell. The dusk had deepened by the time we reached Shadwell, and the river wind carried that mingled odor of tar, smoke, and human toil, which seems peculiar to the eastern reaches of London. The cabman drew up before a row of timbered houses that leaned together like old conspirators, their eaves glistening with the last remnants of drizzle. Holmes stepped down lightly, his gaze roving over the narrow street with an eagerness that was almost boyish. "Note the lamps, Watson," said he softly. "Every second one is out. The gas inspector has been bribed or threatened. An omission too regular to be chance. Darkness, my dear fellow, is rarely accidental." We had halted before a low shop whose painted signboard, Jonas Pike, dealer in marine supplies, was almost illegible beneath layers of grime. A string of oilskins and sailors' caps hung limp in the window, and from the dim interior came the unmistakable smell of salt, tallow, and old rope. A bell tinkled as Holmes pushed the door open. The shop's sole occupant was a heavy-shouldered man with a beard of rusty red and eyes of that shifting blue one sees in the sea under storm. He rose from behind the counter with a surly nod, wiping his hands on an apron. "Mr. Pike, I believe?" Holmes said pleasantly. "That's my name. What's your business?" "I represent an insurance firm engaged in investigating losses upon the river. There was a small matter of a borrowed coat, and an unfortunate accident at Deadman's Wharf. I hoped you might assist us." Pike's brow furrowed. "Accident, you say?" "The only accident I've heard of is a poor fool cut from ear to chin. Nasty trade, the river." "Indeed. You lent him a coat, did you not?" The man scowled. "Who says I did?" Holmes produced a half-crown and spun it idly upon the counter. "A young woman, sir, who fears she may never see her brother again. His name was Tom Corbett." For a moment Pike's expression hardened. Then with a shrug he caught the coin and pocketed it. "Aye, Tom. Worked odd jobs when sober enough to stand. Borrowed a coat Wednesday night. Said he'd be back before morning." "And the coat?" Holmes asked. "Old pea-jacket. Belonged to no one now. If the Rivers took it, she's welcome to it." Holmes leaned against the counter, his voice light but his eyes intent. "I should be sorry to think the river takes all the blame. Tell me, Mr. Pike, you sell lanterns?" "A few," Pike admitted cautiously. "Mostly to bargemen." "Why?" "Because one of your lanterns, or its twin, has been found burning upon a barge beside a murdered man." "A curious circumstance." Pike's hands froze mid-motion, then resumed their work with exaggerated calm. "Lots of lanterns about, mister. All much alike." "Not so alike as you think," Holmes said quietly. "This one had a modified wick, soaked in a substance that allows it to burn blue for a moment before extinguishing itself. A costly trick, unless one has a purpose for it." For the first time, the man's bravado faltered. His eyes flickered toward the back of the shop, where a narrow door stood ajar, revealing a flight of steps descending to a cellar. Holmes followed the glance. "Your storeroom, I take it. Might we—" Pike's answer came too swiftly. "No need, mister. Nothing down there but barrels." Holmes smiled, coldly, thinly. "Of oil, perhaps?" "Of rope," Pike snapped. "Ah," Holmes murmured. "Rope. Yes. One must always have rope ready on the river." There followed a silence so taut that I could hear the faint ticking of Holmes's watch. Then, without warning, Pike snatched something from beneath the counter, a short club of oak, and brought it down with a curse. Holmes had anticipated the move. He stepped aside with the swiftness of a fencer, caught the man's wrist and twisted it sharply. The club fell to the floor. "Enough theatrics," he said coolly. "Watson, the lamp." I reached for the brass lamp that hung above the counter and turned up the flame. The sudden brightness threw the cellar doorway into sharp relief. There, upon the top step, lay a small metal canister, half hidden beneath a tarpaulin. Holmes stooped and retrieved it. The label, though stained and torn, was still legible. "Tianjin blue, lamp compound. Chinese," Holmes murmured, examining the residue within. "Not a dye, but a signal mixture, used in certain docks at Shanghai. A flicker of blue to mark safe passage, or a warning. How curious to find it here." Pike, his wrist still in Holmes's grasp, spat upon the floor. "You've no right. None. I'm an honest trader." "Honest men rarely keep signal mixtures in their rope barrels," Holmes said. "Now, Mr. Pike, if you would prefer to explain this at Scotland Yard—" The man sagged. "No, sir, no yard." Holmes released him, but remained standing between him and the door. "Then explain." Pike rubbed his wrist sullenly. "It weren't my doing. I sell what's brought to me. A fortnight ago a gent comes, tall, well-dressed, talks like he's from the city. He wants a dozen lanterns, no questions asked. Pays in sovereigns. Brings his own oil, says it's for a special order. He left that tin behind when he fetched the rest. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Describe him. Hard to say. Kept his collar up. But his hands. Aye, I remember them. Fine white hands with a scar across one knuckle. The sort you'd not expect to see among the docks. And his name? Never gave it, but the lighter that fetched him across belonged to Mortlake's lease. Holmes's satisfaction was instant but subdued. Excellent. You have been most helpful. I advise you, however, to consider a change of profession. Those who trade in shadows often find themselves swallowed by them. As we stepped back into the night air, I saw that Holmes's expression, though calm, bore the fierce light of discovery. He hailed a passing constable, whispered a brief instruction, and turned his steps toward the river once more. "The pattern clears, Watson," he said as we walked. "A barge adrift, a signal light, a man murdered, a wharf of ill repute, and now a mysterious buyer with a scarred hand. We are moving from the mist into daylight." "But to what end?" I asked. "What purpose can such elaborate signaling serve?" Holmes smiled faintly. "You recall the recent reports of stolen opium shipments from Hong Kong. 1/2 ton vanished from a bonded warehouse last month. The East India Company swears the loss occurred at sea, yet here in the heart of London we find Chinese signal compounds and a man slain for a parcel tied with blue ribbon. I begin to think the Thames has carried her own contraband tide." We paused upon a bridge from which the river lay spread beneath us like a sleeping beast. The fog had lifted somewhat, and the scattered lights of barges winked faintly upon the water. Holmes leaned upon the parapet, his eyes searching the darkness with the fixed intensity of a hawk. "There," he said suddenly. "Do you see it, Watson?" At first I saw nothing but the dull reflection of lamps. Then, as my sight adjusted, I caught a faint flicker far downstream, a bluish spark rising and dying like a will-o'-the-wisp. "The lantern!" I exclaimed. Holmes nodded. "And not alone. Observe. The answering flash from the far bank. There is method here, my dear fellow, a code of light and shadow. Tonight I think the river will whisper its secret." He straightened briskly. "Come. We must hire a boat. Quietly." Within half an hour we had engaged a small skiff from a waterside hostelry, its owner too drowsy to question two gentlemen who paid handsomely. Holmes took the oars, and we moved out upon the dark current, the ripples parting in faint silver arcs before us. The air was thick with damp and the far-off clang of chains. Somewhere a whistle blew, shrill and fleeting like a lost soul. "Keep your eyes on the light, Watson," Holmes murmured. "If I judge the angles rightly, we are headed toward Mortlake's lease." We rode in silence, the great warehouses looming above us like cliffs. Once a shadow moved upon a high gallery, and Holmes ducked low. "They are watching," he whispered, "but not for us. Yet." At last we drew near a cluster of moored barges, half obscured by the wharf's overhang. From one of them came the faint scrape of metal, then a splash, and again that eerie shimmer of blue flame reflected in the water. Holmes held the oars still, and the skiff drifted close. Peering over the gunwale, I saw 2 figures upon the deck of the nearest barge. One held a lantern of the peculiar kind we had already seen. The other stooped over a crate, prizing it open with a crowbar. The soft sound of tearing canvas came to us, and a smell, sweet, heavy, unmistakable, rose upon the air. "Opium," Holmes breathed. As if in answer, the taller of the 2 men straightened. The lantern's faint glow fell across his hand, and I saw the white skin and the scar across the knuckle. Holmes's whisper was electric. "The man from Pike's shop." Before we could move, the taller figure gave a low whistle. Instantly the blue light was snuffed, and the darkness fell thick as velvet. Then came the creak of ropes, the churn of an oar, and the barge began to drift, drawn by an unseen current. Holmes bent to the oars. "After them." We followed, but the fog swallowed our quarry like a curtain closing upon a stage. Only once did we glimpse that ghostly flare again, distant, mocking, a final glint upon the tide. Then all was dark. Holmes rested the oars at last, his breath quick but controlled. "We have seen enough for one night," he said. The light that walks, the hand that kills, the trade that thrives unseen. It is all of a piece now. Tomorrow the river will speak louder. He glanced over his shoulder toward the black water. But for tonight, Watson, we withdraw. The game is dangerous, and the pieces are only half revealed. As we turned the skiff back toward the lamplit shore, I could not shake from my mind the image of that blue flame, brief, unearthly, and cruelly beautiful, dancing above the dark waters of the Thames like the soul of the murdered man, forever adrift between crime and silence. Sherlock Holmes and the Lantern on Deadman's Wharf. Chapter 4th. The Man with the Scarred Hand. It was close upon 10 o'clock the following morning when I awoke to find Holmes already at work. The air of our sitting room bore that mingled perfume of tobacco, ink, and chemical reagents, which had long ago become to me the very essence of Baker Street. On the table lay several small vials, a lens, and the blue-stained envelope which Holmes had labelled Limehouse. He was bending over it now, his thin fingers poised like the talons of a hawk, his expression one of grave absorption. "You slept soundly, Watson," he remarked without looking up. "You may count yourself fortunate. I have spent the greater part of the night classifying the powder we recovered from Pike's cellar." "And the result?" said I, still heavy-eyed from our exertions on the river. He held up a small glass slide, across which the faintest azure shimmer could be seen. "A mixture of potassium nitrate, sulfur, and a Chinese pigment known as Han blue. It burns brightly for a short span, precisely 23 seconds, before extinguishing itself. Admirably suited for signaling across water. It is not sold in London under any license known to the Board of Trade." "So we are dealing with smugglers?" I suggested. "With something rather more systematic than mere smuggling," Holmes said quietly. "A chain that runs from the docks of Shanghai to the counting houses of the city. And somewhere along that chain, our murdered man stood in the way." He turned from the table and regarded me with sudden keenness. "You remember, Watson, the scar upon the gentleman's knuckle?" "Perfectly." "It is not a recent wound. The tissue has thickened, perhaps a year old. Now, you and I saw that same hand last night, and we shall see it again. But before we do, I must have one more piece of the puzzle." He took up his violin and began to play, a soft, wandering air that spoke of patience and hidden thought. Then abruptly he set the instrument aside. "Lestrade will be here at any moment. You had better fortify yourself with breakfast." Our visitor arrived in due course, brisk, red-faced, and in that temper of mingled irritation and respect which Holmes alone could inspire in him. "I've your message, Mr. Holmes," he said, dropping into a chair. "But I tell you plainly, we've got the fellow safe enough. The man Corbett, that's his name. Sailor, drunkard, knife in hand when they found him. He must have fallen foul of his own mischief." "Ah," Holmes murmured. "The convenient explanation. Scotland Yard will never go bankrupt while such accounts are in demand." Lestrade scowled. "You've a better one, no doubt." "Several," said Holmes lightly. "But let us begin with this." He placed upon the table a small glass jar containing a trace of the blue residue. "Kindly have this analyzed at the Yard laboratory. You will find it neither tar nor paint. And while you are there, send a man to Mortlake's lease. If he is wise, he will take a dozen constables with him." The inspector raised an eyebrow. "And what will he find there?" "Perhaps nothing. Perhaps a store of crates marked T but weighted too heavily for leaves. Perhaps the gentleman with the scarred hand. If he is absent, you will find evidence of a boat that left at dawn." Lestrade's expression darkened. "You've been playing detective again, Mr. Holmes." "I never stopped," Holmes replied. "Do you suppose I row about the Thames for pleasure? Go, Lestrade, before the tide turns both in the river and the case." The inspector muttered something about fancies and fireworks, but he took the jar and went. When the door had closed behind him, Holmes sank into his armchair and steepled his fingers. "He will blunder into the aftermath, of course," he said. "But he may flush a witness for us." "What do you expect him to find?" "Men who have vanished, goods that have shifted, and a story told by silence. In the meantime, we shall pay a visit to the docks, under different names." I confess I was startled. "You mean to go in disguise?" "Disguise, my dear Watson, is the handmaid of truth. The trick lies not in the costume, but in the conviction. You will be my brother. Dr. John Hardy, ship's surgeon, lately returned from Bombay. I shall be your clerk. And our object? To find the scarred hand before he finds us. Within the hour we were descending from a tram at Wapping, attired as two men of modest means, myself in a seaman's pea-jacket, Holmes in a clerk's coat of threadbare black, his chin shaded with a false beard that transformed his sharp features into those of a weary, deferential bookkeeper. No eye that day would have taken him for the most brilliant mind in Europe. We made our way toward the quays, where cargoes of jute, tea, and lacquer ware lay in ordered chaos. The cries of the stevedores, the clash of chains, and the reek of hemp filled the air. Holmes paused now and then to glance at the ledgers pinned beside the warehouses. "Observe, Watson," he said, "the entries marked in blue ink. A curious coincidence, do you not think, that each refers to consignments from Hong Kong received at Mortlake's lease?" Before I could reply, a man stepped from one of the office doors, a tall figure well dressed with a stick under one arm and gloves upon his hands. He moved with the assurance of one accustomed to command. As he turned to issue instructions to a foreman, I caught sight of his right hand, the hand with the scar across the knuckle. Holmes's posture altered by the merest fraction. "Our quarry," he whispered. The man came toward us, frowning slightly at our idle stance near the Wharf records. "You there?" he called. "What's your business?" Holmes removed his cap with an air of humble civility. "Beg pardon, sir. I'm looking for a berth for my brother here, ship's surgeon. We heard there was a vessel, the Eastern Empress, taking crew for the passage to Hong Kong." The stranger's eyes rested on us keenly. "The Empress sails from Tilbury, not here. Who told you otherwise?" "A man named Pike, sir," Holmes said evenly. "Said we'd find the agent at Mortlake's lease." The effect of those words was immediate. The man's hand tightened upon his stick, and a shadow of unease crossed his features. But in an instant he recovered. "Pike is a fool who drinks too much. There's no work here for you. Be off." He turned sharply and strode down the wharf. Holmes watched him until he vanished among the cranes. "Well?" I said. "You've seen him. What now?" Holmes's eyes were aglow. "Now, Watson, we follow, but not at once. Give the spider time to feel secure in his web." He led me along a circuitous route through the warehouses until we came to a small coffee house frequented by sailors. There, from a window seat, we commanded a partial view of the wharf. Presently the man reappeared, walking swiftly toward a waiting carriage. "Notice the crest upon the panel," Holmes murmured. "That is no river tradesman's conveyance. The initials, H.F., belong to a firm in Lombard Street, Harcourt and Fenton Importers." "Then our man is a city merchant." "Precisely, a respectable facade for disreputable traffic. Come, Watson, the chase ascends from the river to the counting-house." That afternoon found us in Lombard Street, where commerce beats with a pulse as steady as a clock's. The brass plate of Harcourt and Fenton gleamed upon the doorway of a sober building wedged between two banks. Within, clerks moved noiselessly among stacks of ledgers, and the faint scent of ink and varnish replaced the river's odor of oil and salt. A middle-aged gentleman with iron-grey whiskers came forward. "You wish to see Mr. Fenton?" he asked. "If convenient," Holmes replied in the deferential tone of a provincial merchant. Mr. Fenton received us in a well-appointed room lined with ship's charts. He was a man of polished manners, and though his expression betrayed nothing, I thought I detected a flicker of recognition in his eyes when he looked upon Holmes's face. "My clerk informs me you have a proposal." Holmes bowed. "A trifling matter. I am concerned with the import of medicinal compounds from the East. I had hoped your firm might advise me as to storage facilities at Limehouse." Fenton's fingers tapped the desk. "Our warehouses are engaged exclusively by our own consignments, sir." "I had heard," Holmes said lightly, "that your partners employ Mortlake's lease." Fenton's eyes narrowed. "You are misinformed. That property is under separate management." "Indeed!" Then perhaps you will tell me the name of the manager. I should like to seek his counsel. I am afraid I cannot recall. Some underagent, I believe. He smiled thinly. You understand, Mr. Hardy, said Holmes. Dr. John Hardy. Ah, yes. You understand that our firm has no connection with any operations of which you speak. Good day. The interview was over. We took our leave, but not before Holmes's sharp glance had caught sight of a leather portfolio upon the desk, stamped with a monogram, H.F., and beneath it, faint but visible, the same circular watermark as upon the labels of Pike's canisters. Once in the street, Holmes drew a deep breath of the cool air. It is all of a piece, Watson. Harcourt and Fenton finance the operation. Hartley manages the docks. The Scud man, perhaps Harcourt himself, supervises the transfer. And between them lies a murdered sailor who learned too much. You believe Corbett was in their employ? Undoubtedly. A messenger, a go-between. The packet tied with blue ribbon contained either an account or a sample. He was lured to the barge under pretense of payment, then silenced. But why the lantern? Holmes's voice grew thoughtful. A signal, perhaps, to assure an accomplice across the water that the deed was done, or to summon a vessel to bear away the evidence. Yet there is something more, Watson. The light was meant not merely to show, but to time. A flame of 23 seconds. A clock of fire. He stopped abruptly and turned to me. Do you recall the sound we heard last night? The tinkle like glass? Yes. Then we are nearer than I thought. That sound was not chance. It was a bell mechanism, timed to coincide with the flame's extinction. A light and a bell, signal and confirmation. The precision of it, Watson. We are dealing with men who value seconds as much as sovereigns. That evening, as dusk fell once more upon the river, Holmes stood at the window of our lodgings, gazing out upon the curling smoke of the city. Tonight, he said softly, we return to Mortlake's lease. There is a tide that serves every purpose, and tonight it will serve ours. I followed his gaze to the gathering gloom. The fog was rising from the Thames again, slow and ghostly, as if the river itself breathed secrets into the air. Somewhere beyond that veil lay the men who killed Tom Corbett, and the truth that burned blue upon the water. Holmes turned to me, his face lit by the fire's glow. Bring your revolver, Watson. We shall have need of it before the night is through. Chapter 5. The Trap at Mortlake's Lease. The evening which followed remains etched in my memory with peculiar vividness. It was one of those nights peculiar to London in late autumn, when the air seems half mist, half smoke, and the river below the bridges gleams with a greasy pallor, reflecting the wavering lamps above it. The fog, rolling in slow, ghostly waves, muffled every sound to a sepulchral hush. Even the traffic of the embankment, that endless percussion of hooves and wheels, was stifled into a dull murmur, as though the city itself held its breath. Holmes was in rare spirits. His movements possessed the calm precision of a man certain of his ground, though his speech, when it came, was clipped and economical. Watson, said he, adjusting the strap of his dark overcoat, you will do me a favor tonight. No heroics, no conjecture, and above all, no coughing. The fog will conceal us, but it will also carry sound like a whisper through a keyhole. We must be ghosts, my dear fellow, ghosts that breathe but once. I promise restraint, said I, slipping my revolver into the pocket of my coat, though I cannot vouch for the weather. He smiled faintly, that flicker of dry amusement which was to Holmes what warmth is to other men. The weather is our ally tonight. It will hide our movements as surely as it will disguise those of the enemy. At 9:30 we set out from Baker Street, taking a cab as far as Shadwell. The driver, muffled in his coat, glanced at us through the fog with that vague curiosity London cabmen reserve for passengers who ask for obscure destinations at inconvenient hours. From there we proceeded on foot through the labyrinth of alleys that led to the river. The damp air reeked of tar and rotting hemp. The boards beneath our feet were slick with slime. At last we reached the low, sprawling structure known as Mortlake's Lease, a cluster of warehouses that jutted upon the Thames like a row of dark teeth. A dim lamp burned near the gate, but the wharf beyond was swallowed in mist. Holmes paused in the shadow of a pile of timber and motioned for silence. "There will be movement before the tide turns," he whispered. "Our quarry depends upon precision, and the ebb at midnight affords them their only window." "And what precisely do you expect to occur?" He glanced at me sidelong. "A rendezvous, Watson. A meeting between the river and the city. One bears contraband, the other pays for silence. If I am not mistaken, the light will burn blue before the bargain is struck." We waited. Time in that fog seemed to lose all meaning. The only sounds were the slow lap of the water and the occasional creak of cordage from the moored barges. Once a rat scurried past my boot, its claws clicking on the planks. Holmes remained motionless beside me, a darker shadow among shadows. Then, from somewhere across the river, there came that faint, unmistakable tinkle, a bell of glass, delicate as crystal. Holmes's hand tightened upon my sleeve. "There," he breathed. "The signal." I peered into the fog. At first I saw nothing. Then slowly a small light bloomed upon the water. A tiny flame, burning with a bluish hue that made the surrounding darkness seem all the more profound. It moved gently, swaying like a lantern carried by an unseen hand. A second light answered it from our side of the wharf. The two glimmers hovered, one on each bank, as if exchanging silent greetings. Holmes's voice was barely audible. "Observe, Watson. The choreography of crime. The river speaks to the shore, and the shore replies." As he spoke, the creak of a rope reached us, followed by the splash of oars. A small, low craft was stealing toward the moored barges, her rowlocks muffled with rags. Two figures occupied her, one at the oars, the other crouched near the prow, his face hidden by the brim of his hat. On the wharf a door opened, and a man stepped forth bearing a lantern shielded by a cloth. The glow illuminated his features for a fleeting moment. It was Percival Hartley, the shipping agent we had visited days before. Holmes's hand gestured slightly. The spider at the center of the web. Hartley looked about him cautiously, then waved his lantern thrice. The boat drew alongside, and the man in the prow climbed up onto the planks. The second figure followed, carrying what appeared to be a heavy crate between them. "Two crates," Holmes murmured. "The one they deliver, and the one they receive." I caught my breath as the taller of the two turned his head toward the faint light. The scarred hand caught the glow. Holmes's whisper was like the crack of a whip. "The man with the scar. We have them both." We crouched lower as Hartley and his companions knelt beside the crates, prying open the lids. Even at our distance, I caught the cloying, unmistakable scent that rose from the opened wood. "Opium," said Holmes grimly. "Enough to poison. Dear regiment." The men spoke in low tones, their words indistinct. Then Hartley handed something small to the scarred man, perhaps a ledger, perhaps the fatal packet of blue ribbon that had cost poor Tom Corbett his life. The other took it, examined it by the lantern light, and nodded. There followed the exchange of the crates, a clasp of hands, and then the first man turned back toward his boat. Holmes leaned close to my ear. "Now, Watson, we must move before they part." He signaled softly with his whistle, a sound so low it was lost almost at once in the murmur of the tide. From the shadows at the far end of the wharf, three figures materialized. Lestrade and two constables, who had lain in ambush since dusk at Holmes's direction. They moved swiftly and silently toward the meeting place. But fate, or folly, intervened. The lantern, which Hartley had placed upon the crate, slipped and fell, striking the planks with a sharp clang. The sound seemed to shatter the fog. The scarred man spun round, his eyes catching the movement of the constables. "Trap!" he shouted. Instantly the scene dissolved into chaos. The boatman leapt for the water. The scarred man drew a revolver, and Hartley stumbled backward, striking his head against a piling. The crack of a pistol shot rang out, then another. A bullet splintered the wood beside me. Holmes sprang forward. "Stop him, Watson! The man in the boat!" I fired once, the flash blinding in the fog. The boat rocked violently, the rower cried out and collapsed. The scarred man turned toward me, his revolver raised, but before he could fire, Lestrade and his men were upon him. There was a brief, savage struggle. Then the man was borne down, cursing and thrashing like a netted shark. When the last echoes had died, Holmes stood over the captured criminal, his expression one of cold triumph. "Mr. Fenton, I believe," he said softly. The prisoner glared up at him, his handsome features twisted with hatred. "You meddling fool, you've ruined a trade that fed half the docks." "I have stopped a trade that killed them," Holmes replied, "and you have added murder to your balance sheet." Fenton's laugh was mirthless. "You've no proof." Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Proof enough lies in those crates, Inspector, and in the hand that wrote your ledgers." Hartley, half-conscious, was lifted by the constables. "He will recover," Holmes observed, "and when he does, I think he will find his memory most inconveniently clear." By the time the fog began to thin, dawn had crept over the river. The police launch, summoned by Lestrade's whistle, came gliding through the mist, its lantern cutting a pale path across the water. The captured men were taken aboard, their expressions grim and defeated. Holmes stood upon the wharf, his coat drawn close, gazing after them. "You see, Watson," he said quietly, "crime, like commerce, depends upon punctuality. Their system was perfect, save for one small detail." "And what was that?" "The unpredictable conscience of an honest man. Samuel Blake, who could not ignore the smell of corruption in his lantern. Had he done as Hartley advised and held his tongue, the river would have swallowed all." I looked down at the damp planks where the blue lantern had burned. "And the light itself?" "An invention worthy of any naval signalman," Holmes said. "The compound burned blue to attract attention for 23 seconds, just long enough to confirm the rendezvous. The bell, triggered as it died, signaled completion. Ingenious and fatal." We turned from the river as the sun broke weakly through the clouds. Holmes's features softened in the pallid light. "There is poetry in justice, Watson," he murmured. "A lantern that betrayed its master, a fog that concealed but did not protect, and the tide itself that bore the truth to shore. The river keeps no secrets forever." Later that morning, back at Baker Street, Lestrade appeared once more, his usual bluster somewhat subdued. "The Yard sends its compliments, Mr. Holmes. We've got Fenton, Hartley, and half a dozen others. The papers will call it the Blue Lantern affair." Holmes inclined his head. "A misnomer, but a tolerable one. If they must colour their crimes, blue will serve as well as any." Lestrade hesitated at the door. "You'll forgive me, sir, but how did you guess it all?" Holmes's smile was faint. "Guess, Inspector?" "I observed the residue beneath the dead man's nail, the adulterated oil, the scarred hand, the blue powder, the silence at Mortlake's lease. Each spoke a single word. Together they told a sentence." When the inspector had gone, Holmes stretched himself in his chair and reached for his violin. "Another thread snipped from the web of the world," he said, drawing a slow note. "But I fear there are always more." I took my seat by the fire, the morning light glancing off the window panes, and could not help but reflect, as I have so often, that the genius of my friend lay not merely in the detection of crime, but in his profound comprehension of the darker poetry of human nature. And far down the river, I fancied, the tide still whispered against the wharf, softly, rhythmically, as if repeating a name that London had already forgotten. Chapter 6. The Return of the River Ghost. It was on the second evening after the arrests at Mortlake's lease that the case, which I had believed concluded, took the most unexpected and sinister of turns. The morning papers had carried long columns describing the opium syndicate exposed by the genius of Mr. Sherlock Holmes. They were full of the usual embroidery, in which the work of the police was magnified and my friend's part, by his own quiet insistence, was half forgotten. Holmes had read these accounts with a kind of languid amusement, then turned back to his chemical retorts as though he had dismissed the matter entirely. "Public acclaim," he remarked, "is the confetti thrown by ignorance upon accident. I prefer precision." And with that he had devoted himself to an experiment involving the crystallization of certain alkaloids from tobacco ash, an operation so delicate that he forbade me even to stir the fire. I confess I felt some disappointment that he could so easily turn his mind from an affair which, in my estimation, was among the most dangerous of his career. Yet that was the peculiar temperament of Sherlock Holmes. To him a solved case was a spent cartridge. It was not until dusk that any hint of further development arrived. We were sitting by the hearth when Mrs. Hudson entered with a card upon a tray. "A gentleman to see you, sir," she said. "He looks that pale. I'd swear he'd seen a ghost." Holmes took the card, raised an eyebrow, and smiled faintly. "Inspector Lestrade, you will observe, Watson, that ghosts are no respecters of official rank." A moment later our visitor was shown in. Lestrade's ruddy complexion had taken on an unhealthy hue, and his usually brisk manner was tempered by unease. "I hope I don't intrude, Mr. Holmes," he began, "but I've a matter that won't wait." Holmes waved him to the fire. "You are always welcome, Inspector. Pray compose yourself. You bring tidings of our prisoners, I presume." "I do, and it's devilish strange. Hartley's confessed to more than a dozen runs of contraband. We've got the ledgers, the papers, the codes, all as you said. But this morning when they brought up Fenton for questioning, he was dead." I started. "Dead? From what cause?" Lestrade rubbed his hands nervously. "Poison, the surgeon thinks. Some sort of alkaloid. Quick as lightning, left no sign. The warder swears he took nothing but the tea they gave him at dawn." Holmes's expression hardened. "Tea, you say?" "Yes. Brewed by another prisoner, a petty thief named Ellis. He swears he only followed orders. The canister came from the kitchen, sealed and clean." Holmes rose abruptly and began to pace. "And Hartley?" "Alive, for the moment, but shaking like a leaf. Keeps muttering about lights on the river. Blue lights coming for him." "Lights?" I exclaimed. "Surely his mind is giving way." "Perhaps," said Holmes quietly, "and perhaps not. Tell me, Lestrade, Fenton's body is at the mortuary." "It is." "Then you will accompany us there at once." Lestrade blinked. "At this hour?" "At this hour," Holmes repeated. "The living have told us all they know. It is time to question the dead." An hour later we stood in the chill silence of the city mortuary. The attendants, familiar with Holmes's reputation, made no protest when he requested a lamp and a few simple instruments. Fenton's body lay beneath a sheet upon the central table, the sharp lines of his features still bearing the stamp of that cold pride which had marked him in life. Holmes lifted the sheet, studied the face for a long moment, and then examined the lips and nails through his lens. "No staining," he murmured, "no odor upon the breath. The pulse stopped cleanly. Yes, an alkaloid indeed, but not one administered by mouth. Observe, Watson, the minute puncture beneath the ear." I bent close. It was scarcely visible, a mere pinprick in the skin. "Injected," Holmes said. "By needle or thorn. The poison entered the bloodstream directly." Lestrade stared. "But how? In the name of heaven—" "Someone had access to his cell," Holmes interrupted. "A visitor, perhaps, under pretext of confession or counsel. Or, more likely, a message conveyed through less human agency." "Less human," I repeated. Holmes replaced the sheet with care. "There are ways, Watson, by which men may kill without entering a room. A note, a flower, even a thread may carry death. I have seen it before." He turned to Lestrade. "Hartley must be removed to another cell, with guards at both doors and no contact of any kind, and send word to me the instant he speaks again of those lights." Lestrade nodded, visibly relieved to have orders. "You'll have it, Mr. Holmes." As the inspector departed, Holmes stood in the doorway of the mortuary, gazing out upon the damp courtyard beyond. A faint drizzle had begun to fall, and in the far distance the muffled toll of a bell drifted from the river. He turned to me suddenly. "Watson, have you ever known the Thames to toll?" "It may have been St. Saviour's, or it may not," said he grimly. "Come, We go to Limehouse. The river has begun to speak again. The fog lay thick over the docks as we made our way once more toward Deadman's Wharf. The lamps burned dim and far apart, their halos mere smudges in the gloom. At the water's edge we found Samuel Blake, the faithful watchman, wrapped in his greatcoat and peering uneasily toward the tide. "Mr. Holmes," he exclaimed, "I'm glad you've come. There's something abroad tonight, something wicked. I seen it with my own eyes." "What have you seen, Blake?" "The light, sir. The very same light as before. Just now, an hour past, it was burning out yonder, blue as a corpse's lips. No boat near it, no sound but the water. I swear it, sir, on my soul." Holmes's face was set in marble stillness. "Show me where." We followed him along the wharf until we reached the same spot where the barge had been found. The tide was half in. A damp mist coiled over the river, hiding its surface. Then, as if in answer to Blake's words, a faint shimmer appeared, a bluish spark that flared, faded, and flared again. "There!" Blake cried. "You see it, gentlemen?" Holmes raised his glass and watched intently. "Yes," he said slowly. "I see it. And I would give a month's rent of Baker Street to know who kindled it." "Could it be a trick of reflection?" I asked. "No, Watson. That is a flame, an artful chemical flame. It burns upon something that floats, perhaps a small cork or glass phial, and if my conjecture is correct—" He broke off abruptly, stooped and examined the planking at our feet. "Fresh footprints. 3 pairs. One heavy, one light, and one, with a heel worn to the edge. That, I think, belongs to a gentleman who should at this hour be under lock and key." I stared at him in astonishment. "You mean Hartley?" "Unless there is another man lame on the right foot who frequents this wharf," Holmes replied. As if to confirm his suspicion, a faint splash came from the water below, followed by the ripple of something moving swiftly away. Holmes darted to the edge, but the fog swallowed all. Only the dying glow of the blue light remained, quivering upon the tide. "Gone," he said quietly, "but not beyond recall. He has escaped, or been removed, for a purpose. And if I am not mistaken, the purpose is murder once more." We returned to Baker Street near midnight. Holmes paced the room restlessly, every nerve taut. "The man we believed a pawn has become the last surviving witness," he said. "Someone fears his tongue, and silences all who might betray the master of this trade. Fenton is dead. Hartley has fled or been taken. There remains only the river, and she too begins to tell tales." He went to the window and drew back the curtain. A thin drift of fog pressed against the panes, luminous in the lamplight. "Watson," said he, "within 48 hours this case will be over, or I shall join Fenton in the ledger of the dead." I protested at this grim prophecy, but he only smiled faintly. "The lantern on Deadman's Wharf burns for more than smugglers. It is the beacon of something deeper, a design so intricate that only its shadow has reached us. But mark me, my friend. Tomorrow night we shall lift that shadow." He turned abruptly, his eyes alight with purpose. "Get some rest, Watson. We rise before dawn. I have an experiment to make. An experiment with light that may illuminate more than the fog." Sleep came little to me that night. The vision of that ghostly blue flame danced before my eyes, mingling with the memory of Fenton's cold face and Hartley's terrified whisper of lights that would come for him. The river, it seemed, had not finished its work. It was stirring again, patient, inexorable, and dark. And in the chamber below, through the thin boards of the floor, I could hear the soft movements of Holmes, steady, tireless, deliberate, as he prepared for whatever dreadful revelation awaited us at the next rising of the tide. Chapter 7. The House of Silent Lamps. The morning dawned grey and airless, with that peculiar stillness that precedes a storm. A fine rain clung to the windows of Baker Street, and the whole of London seemed wrapped in an unnatural hush. When I descended to breakfast, I found Holmes already in his chair by the hearth, his dressing-gown hanging loosely about him, his eyes burning with the fierce light of concentrated thought. The breakfast tray before him lay untouched save for the coffee, which had gone cold. Upon the table were spread a curious collection of objects: 2 lanterns of identical make, several glass phials containing a blue-tinted fluid, a clockwork mechanism resembling a small bell, and a shallow basin filled with water. Holmes was adjusting the wick of one lantern with surgical precision. "Ah, good morning, Watson," said he without looking up. "You are punctual, which is more than can be said for Lestrade. Sit and attend me. I believe we stand at the edge of the matter." "You have discovered the secret of the lantern?" I asked eagerly. "Discovered? No, my dear fellow. I have recreated it." He smiled thinly and struck a match. "The distinction is everything." He lit the lamp. At once a clear blue flame sprang to life within the chimney, casting an eerie radiance over the room. The shadows deepened, and for a moment I fancied the very air itself took on a spectral hue. "You will observe," Holmes continued, "that this is no ordinary lamp oil. It is a compound derived from naphtha and a trace of copper acetate, an oriental mixture known to certain smugglers as Tianjin blue. It burns with a distinctive color for exactly 23 seconds before exhaustion. Observe the bell." He gestured toward the clockwork device beside the basin. The blue light flickered, guttered, and precisely as it died, a faint metallic chime sounded. "The signal," I murmured. "Exactly," said Holmes, his eyes gleaming. "The lantern's flame and the bell's tone, sight and sound in harmony. Each light upon the river was an instrument in a larger symphony. The smuggler's trade required precision. The signals served both to time the exchange and to confirm the passage of contraband, but last night's reappearance of the flame— that, Watson, was no smuggler's code." He extinguished the lamp and leaned back, his fingers pressed together. "It was a summons." "A summons? From whom?" "From whoever commands the trade still." Before I could press him further, Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. Holmes tore it open, scanned it, and tossed it across the table. It was from Lestrade, to Holmes, Baker Street. Hartley's cell found empty at dawn, bars sawn cleanly, no sign of struggle. Warder insists no one passed, blue residue on floor near window. Lestrade. Holmes's face grew ashen. "So, the light burns again and the dead rise to follow it." He rose abruptly. "Watson, we must go to Limehouse at once. But first—" He seized his coat and thrust the small bell apparatus into his pocket. "There is one man in this city who can tell us where that blue flame is made. His shop stands by the river behind the sign of the 3 lamps. If fortune favors us. He has not yet fled." We reached Limehouse within the hour. The streets glistened with drizzle, the air thick with the mingled scents of opium and coal smoke. At the far end of Narrow Street, half concealed between 2 warehouses, hung a rusted sign depicting 3 crossed lamps. The shop below it was shuttered, yet a faint thread of smoke issued from the chimney. Holmes knocked twice. There was no answer. He tried the latch. It yielded. We stepped inside. The interior was dim, lit only by the dull glow of a furnace at the far end. Glass retorts, flasks, and alembics crowded the shelves, their contents gleaming like jewels in the gloom. The air was thick with the odor of chemicals, sharp, metallic, unmistakably foreign. "An alchemist's den," I whispered. "Or a chemist's," Holmes replied softly. "One who serves 2 masters, the trade and the underworld." From behind a curtain at the back of the room came the faint scrape of movement. Holmes motioned me to silence and advanced, his revolver drawn. He swept aside the curtain with a single motion. A man sat hunched over a table, his thin fingers trembling as they worked a pestle in a glass mortar. He was of unmistakably Chinese descent, his face narrow, his hair drawn back and coiled. Yet it was his eyes that struck me most, eyes that glittered with a curious mixture of fear and resignation. Holmes addressed him in a tone of studied calm. "Good morning, Mr. Lee. The hour is late, but your lamp still burns." The man started, then composed himself. "I make oil, sir, for the lamps of the docks, Nothing more. Oil that burns blue? A shadow crossed his face. For the theatre, perhaps. Decorative. Holmes laid the small bell device upon the table. For the theatre of the Thames, you mean? Come, Mr. Lee, you and I both know the scent of Tianjin blue. You supplied it to Mortlake's lease, and now one of your patrons lies dead by poison, a poison of your own making. Lee's composure faltered. His eyes darted toward the door. Holmes's voice hardened. Do not attempt to flee. The constable outside will prevent that. Tell me, who ordered the last consignment? Lee hesitated. I do not know his name. English gentleman. Came by night. He pays well. He asks only that I fill the flasks and deliver them to the barge Lydia at the wharf. Holmes's expression sharpened. The Lydia, an old lighter, abandoned these 6 months. It seems the dead do not rest even in their vessels. Did this gentleman bear any mark by which you might recall him? Lee swallowed. He wore gloves. But once, when he reached for his purse, I saw, how you say, the tattoo of a lantern upon his wrist. Holmes's eyes blazed. A lantern. Good heavens, Watson, do you not see? It is no mere symbol. It is the signature of the very man whose contraband we thought extinguished. The master of the trade still lives. Lee rose suddenly, his face ashen. No, sir, he does not live. What do you mean? He came here last night. He say he go to the river for the last time. He say the blue lights will burn once more, and then no more. I think he meant to die. Holmes was silent for a long moment. Then very quietly he said, The river has its own confessional, Watson, and it never grants absolution without a price. By the time we emerged from the shop, the rain had strengthened into a steady downpour. The streets ran black with water. Holmes walked swiftly, his head bent, his thoughts evidently racing. Watson, he said at last, I begin to discern the full outline. Fenton and Hartley were not the architects of this enterprise. They were agents, nothing more. The true mind behind it remains unseen. A man who commands the river's loyalty and fears no law but his own. If lie speaks true, that man will go to the water tonight, and wherever he goes, the blue flame will follow. You think he means to destroy himself? Or to destroy all that might betray him? The lantern burns both to signal and to purge. We reached the embankment as twilight deepened. The fog was rising once more, dense and luminous. Across the river, through the drifting vapor, a faint light pulsed. Blue, intermittent, beckoning. Holmes stopped dead. There, Watson, the ghost returns. Come, this may be our last chance. We ran down the steps toward the water's edge, where a single boat lay moored. Holmes sprang aboard, seized the oars, and pushed off. The current caught us at once, drawing us toward the heart of the mist. The city faded behind us until nothing remained but the dim outline of lamps and the soft lap of the tide. The light ahead flickered and steadied, growing brighter as we neared. It hung low upon the water, like a star fallen to earth. And then, as we drew closer, I saw a man stood upon a small raft, motionless, a lantern in one hand. His face was hidden by the hood of his coat, but the light illumined the tattoo upon his wrist. A lantern, the same as Lee had described. Holmes shipped the oars. Hold fast, Watson. We must not startle him. The man raised his head. His voice carried clearly through the fog, calm and strangely detached. You should not have come, Mr. Holmes. On the contrary, Holmes answered. I never refuse an invitation, least of all one given by light. The man laughed softly. Then watch, and see the last lantern die. He lifted the lamp high above his head. The blue flame flared brighter, dazzling against the mist, and then with a hiss it burst, scattering sparks across the dark surface of the Thames. For an instant the water blazed with eerie phosphorescence. When the glow subsided, the man was gone. The raft drifted empty. Holmes leaned forward, scanning the water. He has gone under. The river has taken him. I shuddered. Good Lord. Was it suicide? Not suicide, Holmes said quietly. A ritual, the extinguishing of his own signal. He has ended the chain, as he vowed. But Watson, He paused, staring into the gloom. Why do the lights still burn? For even as he spoke, 2 more blue flames flickered into life along the opposite bank, steady, silent, and waiting. Chapter 8. The Signal from the Depths. The events of that dreadful night upon the Thames had left both my nerves and imagination strained to the utmost. Even in recollection the scene remains vivid, the blue flames glimmering like ghostly eyes through the mist, the lone figure upon the raft vanishing as though the river itself had claimed its due, and Holmes's uncharacteristic silence as we drifted back toward the shore. We reached the steps at Wapping just as dawn began to grey the eastern sky. Holmes secured the boat without a word and stood gazing down at the water. The current swirled sluggishly, flecked here and there with dull traces of blue that glowed faintly before fading altogether. "You saw them, Watson?" he asked at last. "2 flames answering one another across the river." "I saw them. But if the man was dead, if he went under, who else could have kindled them?" "That is precisely the question," said Holmes grimly. "Either we are dealing with accomplices yet at large, or with a design more infernal than I have yet imagined." He turned away abruptly. "Come. There is nothing more to be learned here. The river will keep its silence until it chooses to speak again." By 10 o'clock that morning we were back at Baker Street. Holmes had changed his soaked garments for his customary dressing gown, but his face was pale and drawn. His pipe lay cold upon the mantelpiece. He had taken instead to pacing the carpet with that restless, pantherine tread which to me signified the strain of unrelieved concentration. "Watson," said he suddenly, "you recall the lantern tattoo upon the man's wrist?" "Clearly. That mark is our key. It is no mere ornament. It is the insignia of a society, an Eastern Brotherhood, devoted to the secret traffic in narcotics. They call themselves the Order of the Lantern. The blue flame is their sign of fealty. To betray it is death." I stared at him in astonishment. "You mean that what we saw last night was not the end of the affair, but some act of vengeance within their own ranks?" "Perhaps vengeance, perhaps succession. These orders rarely tolerate a vacancy. When one light is extinguished, another must be kindled. That, I believe, was the meaning of the twin flames, the appointment of a new master." "Then the society still lives?" "Lives and watches," Holmes said quietly. "And I have thrust my hand into their nest." He crossed to the window, peered down into the street, then turned back with that sudden, dangerous brightness that came upon him when danger was near. "They will not rest while I live, Watson, but I have no intention of yielding them the initiative. Before the day is out, we shall confront the Order upon their own ground." I started. "You mean to return to Limehouse?" "Not Limehouse. Deeper. Beneath it." "Beneath?" He smiled slightly. "There are cellars under Mortlake's lease that predate the present wharf. Ancient smuggling tunnels running beneath the warehouses to the river. Fenton and Hartley used them to store contraband, but their real purpose was older still. I mean to see what sleeps in those depths." By noon we had arranged the expedition. Lestrade, summoned by telegram, arrived in a state of considerable alarm. "Mr. Holmes, if you value your life," he began. "Life is a possession I hold only on lease, Inspector," Holmes interrupted. "And tonight we may pay the rent in full. You will have men posted on the wharf by 8 o'clock, but until then, we go alone." Lestrade protested vehemently, but Holmes would not be moved. "Too many feet will startle the quarry," he said. "Watson and I will reconnoitre. You may follow at my signal." The sound of a bell struck thrice. "A bell?" Lestrade repeated blankly. Holmes held up the small clockwork device he had taken from his experiment. "The same that marks their infernal trade, Inspector. We shall let the enemy be summoned by his own note." We set out at twilight. The fog had returned, heavier than before, lying upon the streets like a damp shroud. By the time we reached Mortlake's lease, darkness had fallen entire. The warehouse loomed above us, black against the paler murk of the river. Holmes produced a lantern, an ordinary one this time, and led the way around to the rear, where a half-rotted door yielded to his deft manipulation of the lock. Inside, the air was foul with damp and decay. Dust hung thick in the beam of the lantern. The floor was littered with broken crates, coils of rope, and rusted tools. Holmes moved swiftly and silently among them, searching the walls with his lens. "Here," he said at last. He knelt and scraped away the grime from a patch of brickwork. A few moments' work revealed a small iron ring set into the mortar. He pulled. A section of flooring lifted, revealing a black aperture below. "The river tunnels," he murmured. "Take care, Watson. The steps are steep." We descended cautiously, the air growing colder and wetter with each foot. The tunnel that opened before us was narrow, its walls dripping with moisture, the roof so low that we were forced to stoop. Somewhere ahead I could hear the slow, hollow drip of water. Holmes's voice came low and even. "You will observe the brickwork, Watson. 18th century. The smugglers of that day were as ingenious as any of our own time, and if my calculations are correct—" He broke off abruptly. A faint gleam appeared ahead, a pale bluish glow that pulsed irregularly, reflected upon the wet bricks like light seen through deep water. "The signal," I whispered. Holmes nodded. "Extinguished above, reborn below. The order keeps its vigil." We crept forward. The tunnel widened into a low chamber whose roof was supported by ancient timbers. In the center stood a rough stone pedestal, upon which rested a lantern burning with the unmistakable blue flame. Around it, half hidden by the fog that seeped even here, were several figures, cloaked and motionless. Their faces were shadowed, but I could see the glint of metal upon their wrists. The tattooed lantern, the badge of the order. Holmes touched my arm and pointed. Upon the wall behind the pedestal hung a strange device, a series of tubes and mirrors arranged to project the lantern's light upward through a shaft in the ceiling. "Behold," he murmured, "the mechanism by which the phantom lights are shown upon the river. The dead do not signal, Watson, only the living who speak for them." Before we could withdraw, one of the cloaked figures turned, and the beam of the lantern fell full upon our faces. A shout rang out, echoing horribly through the chamber. "Intruders!" Holmes seized my arm. "Run, Watson! The bell! Strike it!" I fumbled for the little device and struck the hammer thrice. The clear metallic note rang out, once, twice, thrice, then was swallowed by the roar of pursuing feet. We dashed back through the tunnel, the lantern's light dancing wildly upon the walls. Behind us came the cries of our pursuers, nearer with every stride. At that instant, from above, there came a crash and the shout of men. Lestrade and his constables had heard the signal. The trapdoor burst open, and we clambered out into the warehouse just as the first of the cloaked figures emerged from the tunnel. "Stand fast!" Lestrade roared, leveling his revolver. "In the Queen's name!" The melee that followed was brief but furious. The smugglers fought like trapped beasts, but they were outnumbered. Within minutes, the chamber below was cleared, the lantern extinguished, and the surviving members of the order taken into custody. Holmes stood amid the wreckage, his face pale but triumphant. "So ends the Order of the Lantern," he said quietly. "Their lights will burn no more." Lestrade wiped his brow. "You'll have the Yard's thanks for this, Mr. Holmes, and the Home Secretary's besides. But how in heaven's name did you know where to find them?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Because, Inspector, the river speaks in reflections. The light upon its surface is only the shadow of what burns beneath." It was near dawn when we at last turned homeward. The fog was lifting, and through the pale mist the Thames glimmered once more, silent, patient, untroubled. Holmes paused upon the bridge and looked down at its slow, dark tide. "Do you see, Watson? The river cleanses all things, but it never forgets. Every crime upon its banks leaves a ripple that spreads outward until it touches those who believe themselves safe." He drew a deep breath of the cool morning air. "For now, London may sleep. But mark my words, the lantern on Deadman's Wharf will burn again, in some other guise, for some other hand. The river keeps its secrets, but not forever. We turned away as the first light of sunrise broke through the mist, and behind us, faint and far upon the tide, I thought I heard once more the soft chime of a bell. Chapter 9. The Whispering Bell. The morning after the capture of the so-called Order of the Lantern broke with a fragile brightness, as though London herself, weary of the fog and of crime, had resolved to begin anew. Yet despite the sunshine, I sensed that the case weighed heavily upon Holmes's mind. He had spent the small hours in restless pacing, and when I descended at last to breakfast, I found him seated at the table, elbows on knees, head bowed between his hands, the very image of one who hears a sound no other man can. "You look unwell, Holmes," said I. "Surely last night's success might allow you a little rest." He lifted his head slowly. "Rest? My dear Watson, there is no rest for an unfinished pattern. The Order's cell is broken, yes, but its design continues." I poured his coffee and waited. That was always the surest method of drawing him out. Presently he continued, his voice low and measured. "Tell me, did you hear the bell as we left the wharf?" "I fancied I did, faintly from the river." "Not fancy, Watson. It sounded thrice, clear, deliberate, metallic, the same chime that summoned Lestrade. Only this time no hand of mine struck it." "You think it a signal?" "I think it a reply," said he. "Someone answered us from the water, a watcher who knew our code." I confess a chill passed through me at those words. The notion that some unseen presence had followed our movements, waiting to echo our success with its own mocking salute, seemed to touch the very border of the supernatural. Holmes, however, had already risen and was rummaging among the objects upon his work table. "See here," he said, drawing forth the small clockwork bell he had used the night before. "This is the mechanism I carried into the tunnels. When I struck it, the hammer fell upon this tiny plate of steel, a tone pure and distinctive. Now observe." He held to his ear a second, identical device, one of the captured lanterns, dismantled and laid bare. "When a vibration of the same frequency reaches this reed, it sets the hammer within in motion, and the bell answers. Do you understand? It is a primitive form of wireless signaling, crude but effective." "Then the reply could only have come from another of these instruments." "Precisely. And where there is another instrument, there is another operator." He set both bells ringing in sympathetic harmony, their twin notes trembling through the air. "You see, Watson? The Order had a master outside the tunnels, one who heard the signal and returned it. Then we have not yet reached the end." Holmes's smile was grim. "No. The flame is out, but the hand that kindled it still glows with heat, and I propose to find that hand before it cools." By noon, Lestrade arrived, flushed with official triumph. He brought with him a bundle of papers and a face alight with satisfaction. "The Home Secretary himself commends you, Mr. Holmes," he said, depositing his hat. "You've done the Empire a service. Those fellows down there would have flooded London with poison. We'll see them swing, every last one." Holmes inclined his head politely. "I am gratified to hear the nation's thanks, Inspector. But you may tell the Home Secretary that he would do well to keep one eye upon the river still." Lestrade looked puzzled. "You mean there's more of them?" "I mean," said Holmes, "that there is someone above them, and nearer to Whitehall than to Wapping. The Order did not trade in drugs alone. They trafficked in information. Hartley and Fenton were but intermediaries. Someone supplied them with protection, licenses, customs exemptions, and silence." The inspector's good humor evaporated. "That's a grave charge, Mr. Holmes." "It is a grave world, Lestrade. Tell me, who authorized the lease at Mortlake?" Lestrade frowned. "I can find that out, but—" "You will find," Holmes interrupted, "that the lease was registered not to Fenton or Hartley, but to a holding firm under the name Pendrell & Co. Make inquiry as to the owner." Lestrade scribbled the name in his notebook, muttering, "Pendrell & Co. I'll see what can be done," and departed, clearly unsettled. When the door closed, Holmes leaned back, his eyes half closed. "Pendrell," he murmured. "That name has a sinister echo, Watson. I encountered it once before, In a memorandum concerning secret shipments from Bombay, shipments escorted under Admiralty seal. I fear we have stumbled upon a web whose strands reach from the docks to the cabinet. Toward evening, a messenger delivered an answer to Holmes's inquiry, written in Lestrade's hurried scrawl. You were right. Pendrell and Co. were registered under name of Sir Edmund Hale, MP Privy Council. Do you mean to say the man's involved? Holmes read the note twice, then folded it carefully. Sir Edmund Hale, he said softly. The champion of maritime reform, the very man who 3 years ago demanded stricter control of dock labour and river traffic. Oh, the irony of virtue. Watson, I think we must pay a call upon Westminster before the lamps are lit. The rain had ceased, and a thin moon rode above the Houses of Parliament as our hansom drew up before a handsome Georgian residence overlooking the embankment. Sir Edmund received us in his study, a tall man of commanding presence, his iron-grey hair framing a face of habitual composure. Only the faintest tightening at the corners of his mouth betrayed unease. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, is it not? And Dr. Watson, you wish to speak with me regarding some river business? Holmes bowed. A small matter touching your firm's property at Mortlake's lease. My firm? Hale smiled faintly. You must be misinformed. I hold shares in many enterprises, but I conduct no direct trade. Then you deny any connection with Pendrell and Co.? The colour drained subtly from the statesman's face. Pendrell and Co.? You have no right to. On the contrary, Holmes said evenly. I have every right. The company's charter bears your signature. It was through that charter that contraband passed, unsearched, under seal of your office. Hale rose, his eyes blazing. Sir, I will not be insulted in my own house. Sit down, said Holmes, and though his voice remained soft, it carried a force that froze the man where he stood. You have played a deep game, Sir Edmund. Too deep. The Order of the Lantern was your instrument. Through it you financed the importation of drugs under cover of Admiralty privilege, sharing profit and power alike. And when your agents were seized, you sought to erase the evidence by extinguishing the light itself. Hale's lips trembled. You cannot prove this. Holmes withdrew a small parcel from his pocket and placed it upon the table. Here is proof enough. Correspondence between your office and one Fenton, recovered from the tunnels below Mortlake. And here, he drew out the second of the sympathetic bells. Is your voice, Sir Edmund. You were the unseen listener who answered our call last night. Hale stared at the instrument as though it were a living thing. Then you know. Everything. Not everything. Holmes said quietly. I do not yet know whether you intend to face justice or to follow your brethren into the river. For a moment the only sound was the ticking of the clock. Then Hale's hand moved slowly toward the bell. You spoke of the light and the flame, Mr. Holmes. There are powers older than the law, and men who cannot be judged by it. Holmes's eyes hardened. Take care, Sir Edmund. But the man's fingers had already closed upon the small mechanism. There was a faint metallic note, 1, 2, 3, echoing the signal from the tunnels. Somewhere outside, muffled by the distance, another bell answered it. Holmes sprang forward, but too late. Hale's hand darted to his waistcoat pocket. There came a small, sharp sound, a gasp, and he fell back into his chair, lifeless. I reached his side at once. Cyanide, I said. Instantaneous. Holmes nodded grimly. The final link is severed. He took the bell from the dead man's hand. But note, Watson, someone heard his call. There is still an answering bell upon the river. We left the house by a discreet door at the inspector's insistence, for the yard would handle the rest. Outside, the wind had risen again, sweeping along the river with a low moan that might have been the breath of the tide itself. Holmes paused upon the embankment, the small bell glinting in his hand. Listen, he said. Far below, from the darkness of the wharves, came the faint spectral tinkle of a single chime, soft, deliberate, unmistakable. He turned to me, his face drawn but resolute. Do you hear it, Watson? The whispering bell. There is always another to answer. Until that one is silent, our work is not yet done. Chapter D. The House on the Embankment. The hour was late when we left the residence of Sir Edmund Hale, yet neither Holmes nor I felt the least inclination for rest. The man's death, shocking though it was, had brought no conclusion, only a deeper and more disquieting mystery. That faint answering bell from the river had sounded not like an echo, but like a summons, deliberate and mocking. It rang, as Holmes later said, like a whisper from the abyss. We walked in silence along the misted embankment. The lamps burned low, their yellow halos dimmed by fog. The tide lapped softly against the stone, and from time to time a barge drifted by, its lantern swaying like a tired eye. Holmes moved with long, rapid strides, his coat collar turned up, his gaze fixed on the black gleam of the river. At last he stopped abruptly and faced me. "Watson," said he, "this bell, this infernal whisper from the water, can come from but one place." "Where then?" He pointed across the shadowed river to where the massive outline of the Houses of Parliament loomed against the smoky sky. "There," he said, "beneath the very seat of British law. Do you not perceive the irony?" I stared at him in disbelief. "Surely, Holmes, you cannot mean that—" "I mean precisely what I say," he interrupted sharply. "The Order of the Lantern was not a criminal enterprise alone, it was a network, a private communication between the dockside and the drawing-room, between smuggler and statesman. We have cut away the branches, but the root still drinks from the same river." He turned and strode away, his voice low but urgent. "There are old service tunnels beneath the embankment, built when the sewers and gas lines were laid. Some connect directly to the lower vaults of Westminster. If our unseen bell rings from there, then the last secret of this case lies hidden under the house itself." It was near midnight when we reached the northern entrance of the embankment works, a small iron gate half concealed behind a stone arch. Holmes produced a key, the provenance of which I did not inquire, and we descended into a world of dripping stone and echoing darkness. Our lanterns cast narrow cones of light that quivered upon the wet walls. The air was chill and heavy with the scent of the river. Water gurgled somewhere below, and the hollow clang of our boots upon the iron gratings was magnified tenfold by the echoing vaults. Holmes walked ahead, every step measured. His face, pale in the lamplight, bore that expression of fierce abstraction which I had come to know so well, the look of a man hunting not with his eyes but with his mind. "Do you hear it, Watson?" he asked suddenly. I paused, straining my ears. At first there was only the slow drip of condensation from the arch above. Then, faint but distinct, came a metallic chime, distant and hollow. "The bell," I whispered. Holmes nodded grimly. "Nearer than I expected. Come." We followed the sound through a narrow passage that descended steeply toward the river. Twice we passed junctions where side tunnels branched away into utter blackness, and once we startled a rat that fled squealing into the dark. The air grew fouler, thick with the stagnant odor of water long imprisoned. At length we reached a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands. From beyond it came a faint blue glow and unmistakably the slow rhythmic chime of a bell. 3 beats, a pause, 3 again. Holmes extinguished his lantern. "Steel your nerves, Watson," he murmured. "What we are about to see may well test them." He pressed gently on the latch. The door creaked open, revealing a chamber unlike any I had ever beheld. It was a circular vault, perhaps 30 feet across, its walls lined with stone alcoves. In the center stood a low table upon which rested an intricate mechanism of mirrors, lenses, and glass tubes. The very twin, I realized, of the device we had discovered beneath Mortlake's lease. Suspended above it was a lantern burning with that unearthly blue flame, its light throwing shifting reflections across the damp ceiling like water seen from below. And there, seated before the apparatus as though at an altar, was a man. He was dressed in the dark coat of a civil servant, but his face was hidden beneath the brim of his hat. One gloved hand rested upon the table, The other turned the handle of a small bell identical to the one we had found in Hale's possession. The faint metallic note rang out once more, clear and deliberate. Holmes stepped forward, his voice calm and cold. "You may cease your ringing, sir. Your master no longer hears you." The man froze. Slowly he raised his head, and I caught sight of a face I knew. The Secretary to the Admiralty, Mr. Adrian Tregellis, whose name had lately been much in the papers. His countenance was ghastly pale, his eyes wild. "Holmes," he breathed. "So you've come." "I thought as much." Holmes regarded him steadily. "I follow the sound of truth, Mr. Tregellis. It has a peculiar tone. You, it seems, have been the echo all along." Tregellis rose to his feet, swaying slightly. "You do not understand," he said hoarsely. "I did what was necessary. The Empire needs its shadows as well as its light. The opium trade, yes, it was mine. But it financed the very fleet that guards your coasts. You would let the Empire rot for a principle." "The Empire," said Holmes, "was not founded on poison and murder." "Then it will fall on morality," cried the man. His voice rang against the stone. "Do you think I did this for profit? The blue light was never mere contraband. It was a signal, a bond between men who served the crown in silence. Hale was weak. He betrayed us to you, so I extinguished his flame before it could spread." "You killed him?" I exclaimed. "He killed himself," Tregellis answered bitterly, "by losing faith. I merely provided the means." Holmes's tone grew icy. "And what of the others? The sailors dead, the men drowned, the woman who waits in Shadwell for a brother who will not return? Was that service too?" Tregellis's eyes gleamed with a strange fervor. "You cannot comprehend. The blue light will never die. It burns in the hearts of those who protect the realm from within. We are the unseen watch, the lantern of empire." His hand darted to his pocket. Holmes moved like lightning. There was a flash, a scuffle, and the sharp crack of a revolver. The shot echoed deafeningly through the chamber. For an instant I thought Holmes was struck, but it was Tregellis who staggered backward, the pistol falling from his grasp. He collapsed against the table, overturning the lantern. The blue flame flared brilliantly, then guttered and went out. The chamber plunged into darkness. "Holmes!" I cried. "Here, Watson!" His voice came steady from the blackness. "He is finished. Give me the lantern." I relit our lamp. Tregellis lay motionless beside the shattered mechanism, the expression upon his face a curious blend of triumph and release. Holmes knelt beside him, feeling for a pulse, then rose slowly. "Dead," he said. "The final link, and with it the whispering bell falls silent." We emerged from the tunnels shortly before dawn. The first light of morning glimmered upon the river, which flowed on as calmly as though it had never borne the weight of conspiracy or death. Holmes stood a long while watching it, his face pale and weary, but serene. "It is curious, Watson," he said at last. "Men speak of the river as a mirror of London, but it is more than that. It is the city's memory, its conscience. It carries away what we would hide, yet returns it when we least expect. The lantern burned to mark a secret, and the river has washed it clean." He turned to me with a faint smile. "Another light extinguished, another tale consigned to your chronicles. And yet, listen." From somewhere far down the Thames, borne faintly on the dawn breeze, came a single lingering chime, the sound of a bell, soft and solitary. Holmes's eyes glimmered. "Do you hear it, Watson?" "Yes," I whispered. "But what does it mean?" He looked out over the shining water. "It means, perhaps, that the river never truly forgets." Chapter 15. The Dead Man's Testimony. The affair of the Order of the Lantern might, to the mind of any ordinary man, have concluded with the death of Adrian Tregellis and the extinguishing of that unholy blue flame beneath the House of Commons. Yet I had long since learned that Sherlock Holmes never accepted finality when the faintest thread of mystery remained unpulled. For 3 days after our return from the Embankment vaults, he scarcely stirred from Baker Street. He kept to his armchair, rising only to pace before the window, the city's autumn fog curling like pale smoke around his figure. The newspapers, meanwhile, were full of the Lantern conspiracy, how Holmes had exposed a criminal society spanning from Limehouse to Parliament itself. The Times lauded his intellectual audacity, the Standard called him London's unacknowledged Minister of Justice, and even the staid Morning Chronicle hinted that the river's silence has at last been broken by a single clear voice. Holmes read none of them. His violin lay untouched, his meals went cold, and twice I found him standing over the small clockwork bell, recovered from Sir Edmund Hale's study, staring at it as though the thing still whispered to him in some hidden tongue. At last, on the evening of the third day, he spoke. "Watson," said he, "I cannot rest while that bell remains unexplained." "I thought it no more than the last echo of the order," I replied. "Surely its master is gone, its secrets dead with him." Holmes shook his head slowly. "No. Tregellis was a zealot, not a fool. A zealot plans for his own downfall. He was prepared to die, but not without ensuring his gospel would outlive him. There is something still unaccounted for, the signal that answered us on the river even after his death. That, my dear Watson, is the true ghost of Deadman's Wharf." He rose abruptly and went to his writing table, where a small parcel lay wrapped in brown paper. "Lestrade sent this from Scotland Yard this morning," he said, unwrapping it. "The personal effects of Sir Edmund Hale. Observe, if you please." Inside were a few commonplace articles, a pocket watch, a silver snuff-box, and a sheaf of folded documents tied with a narrow blue ribbon. "The ribbon?" I murmured. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Precisely. The same shade found upon the murdered man's packet and upon the wick of the lanterns. The same color that has pursued us through every stage of this case. Blue. The hue of concealment and revelation alike." He untied the ribbon carefully and spread the papers upon the table. They appeared at first to be official correspondence, brief memoranda concerning dockyards, cargoes, and customs tariffs, each bearing Hale's signature. But across the lower margins of several sheets ran a series of curious symbols, small marks, almost like the flourish of a pen idly made, yet subtly varied from page to page. Holmes's face lit with sudden intensity. "Ah, I had hoped for this." He leaned closer, examining the marks through his lens. "A cipher, Watson. Nothing less. Look how each flourish differs by angle and length. A code hidden in plain sight beneath the hand of bureaucracy." "But to what end?" I asked. "To convey what could not be written openly. Tregellis's private communications to Hale were verbal, no doubt, but Hale, in his turn, recorded their essence in this cryptic fashion. He was too cautious to trust memory alone. The question is, what did he wish preserved?" For the next hour Holmes worked without pause, his long fingers flitting over the papers, transposing the symbols into figures, the figures into letters. At times he muttered to himself, at others he fell into a silence so complete that I scarcely dared breathe. At last he sat back, the faintest flush of triumph on his face. "I have it," said he softly. "Listen." He read aloud from his notes, the words chilling in their simplicity. "The flame divided burns unseen. The lantern sleeps in Westminster. The bell will wake the river when the new moon dies." I stared at him. "What in heaven's name does that mean?" "It means," said Holmes gravely, "that the order was not wholly destroyed. Hale speaks of another lantern, one hidden, one yet to burn, and note the phrase, when the new moon dies. That, Watson, occurs this very week. Then you believe." "I believe," he said, rising, "that before the week's end another blue flame will light the Thames, and this time not for smuggling nor signal, but for vengeance." That night Holmes made several visits to the telegraph office, dispatching messages to Lestrade, to the harbour patrol, and to an obscure firm of shipwrights at Deptford. He returned past midnight, soaked by rain but invigorated. "Our adversary is not yet beaten, Watson. The order of the lantern was a serpent. We have cut off its head, but the body still coils. Someone means to rekindle its light. Yet who remains? Holmes looked into the fire, his voice low. Every conspiracy leaves a residue. The ones who watch from the shadows and inherit the ruins. There were whispers among the captured men of a vessel called the Lantern Queen, an old barge refitted as a meeting place. She was last seen moored at Westminster Pier. If Hale's cipher speaks true, that is where the final flame will burn. He glanced at the clock. The new moon dies tomorrow night. We shall be there. The following evening found us once more upon the river, that dark artery of London which had by now become both scene and accomplice in the drama. The moon, a thin crescent, hung low behind a screen of cloud, and the air carried that peculiar metallic tang that precedes rain. Holmes and I stood upon a small police launch, Lestrade at the helm and 2 constables astern, their revolvers ready. "Every approach is covered, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade. "If a match strikes on that pier, we'll see it." "I pray we do," Holmes replied. "Better the light we can face than the darkness that moves unseen." We drifted silently toward Westminster Pier. The Cité. Lamps along the embankment burned dim behind the fog. All else was still. Then, without warning, a bell rang. 3 notes, clear and deliberate. Holmes's head snapped up. "The Whispering Bell!" From the darkness ahead came a faint glow, blue, spectral, swaying gently as though upon the water. Then another answered it from farther downstream. Holmes's voice was taut. "2 flames again. They are answering one another as before." Lestrade gave a signal, and the launch surged forward. The blue light grew brighter until its reflection danced upon the ripples like liquid sapphire. As we drew closer, I saw it emanated from a lantern fixed to the prow of a small, half-sunken barge. Upon its deck stood a single figure, cloaked and hooded. Holmes leapt ashore even as Lestrade cried out for caution. "Hold fast, Watson." The figure turned. The hood fell back, and I beheld the gaunt, familiar features of Percival Hartley, the shipping agent long thought dead. His eyes gleamed with madness. "You cannot drown the light, Mr. Holmes," he shouted. "It lives in the blood of all who served it. Hale betrayed us, Tregellis betrayed us, but I shall keep the covenant." "Put down the lantern, Hartley," Holmes commanded, stepping nearer. "You know what it contains." Hartley laughed. "Yes, justice. The river shall bear it to every dock and wharf. London will see its own corruption burn blue." He raised the lantern high. A strange hiss issued from it. The flame within grew suddenly brilliant, casting a ghastly glow across his face. I saw Holmes move, swift as lightning, but too late. Hartley hurled the lantern into the water. There followed a flash of dazzling light, a roar like thunder, and a column of blue fire leapt from the river's surface. The explosion flung us backward. When the smoke cleared, the barge was gone, splintered and smoking, and the blue glow faded into darkness. Holmes was the first to recover. "No oil burns so fiercely," he said hoarsely. "That lantern was no signal. It was a bomb." Lestrade stared at the shattered water. "Then Hartley's dead?" Holmes's gaze was fixed upon the river, his face unreadable. "Yes," he said at last. "Dead, and with him the last spark of the lantern's fire. But mark this, Lestrade, the flame was man's work, not the river's. The Thames carries no hatred. It merely reflects ours." He turned away. "Come, Watson. The case is ended, though the memory will burn long." We returned to Baker Street near dawn. Holmes said little, but as he laid Hale's papers upon the mantel, I saw his hand tremble ever so slightly. "Watson," he murmured, "have you ever wondered why men build cities beside rivers? I suppose for trade, for life." "Perhaps," he said, "but I think it is because a river is a mirror, and every man must some day confront his own reflection. The lantern was only London's reflection, its greed, its secrecy, its lust for empire. Now the mirror is dark again." He sank into his chair. the first light of morning glimmering upon his pale, worn face. "Write it as you will, my dear fellow. But when you tell the tale, do not name it the Lantern Conspiracy. Call it rather the Dead Man's Testimony, for every man who spoke within it is now silent, save the river itself." Chapter 2. The Blue Inferno. When I look back now upon that long and perilous affair of the lantern on Deadman's Wharf, it seems to me that the case might have closed with Hartley's fiery death upon the river, for all the elements of a grim morality play had been fulfilled. The guilty punished, the innocent avenged, the dark machinery of crime laid bare. Yet Holmes himself, though exhausted in body, was unsatisfied in spirit. "The river has burned," he said to me on the morning following the explosion. "But what precisely has it burned with? The nature of the fire itself remains unknown. Until we understand the flame, Watson, we cannot say what was truly destroyed." He spoke not as a man haunted by conscience, but as one tormented by an incomplete equation. In his eyes I saw the same restless gleam that had preceded so many of his great discoveries. We breakfasted in near silence. Holmes, having taken little nourishment for days, consumed only black coffee and sat smoking in quick, impatient puffs, his long fingers drumming the table. On the mantel stood a glass jar half filled with river water collected that morning by Lestrade's men. The faintest azure film clung to its surface, shimmering when the light struck it. "Observe," said Holmes, gesturing toward the jar. "Even now the residue persists. Hartley's infernal compound has tainted the Thames itself." He drew a slender pipette from his pocket, filled it, and released a drop onto a glass slide. Setting it beneath his microscope, he motioned me closer. "Look here, Watson. What do you see?" The field swam before my eyes, then steadied. Tiny crystalline particles, angular and translucent, yet glimmering faintly blue. "Crystals," I said. "Of copper, perhaps." Holmes smiled faintly. "An understandable conjecture, but these are not metallic. They are organic. The base of the compound is quinine, altered with phosphorus and fused with an extract from a rare plant known only in the East. Lanthra cordata, the lantern flower. Its sap burns with an intense blue light. In proper concentration it is harmless, in excess explosive. Someone, perhaps Tregellis himself, discovered how to distill it into a volatile essence." He rose and began to pace. "Do you not see the irony, Watson? The very light they used as a signal of conspiracy was itself the engine of their destruction. They played with a fire that was both message and weapon." "And you believe Hartley knew this?" Holmes paused before the window, his hands clasped behind him. "I think he suspected. Madness often sees farther than reason, though it misreads the vision. He spoke of burning the corruption from London. To him destruction was purification." He turned sharply. "Yet one question remains unanswered. Who first brought the compound to England? The lantern flower grows only in certain coastal provinces of China. Such knowledge does not drift into Limehouse by chance." "Fenton?" I ventured. "Fenton was a merchant, not a chemist. The formula predates him." He strode to his desk and opened a folder of papers. "I have been re-examining the letters seized from Hale's study. Among them is a single reference to an unknown correspondent, identified only by the cipher initials HM. Listen. The Eastern compound is most efficacious. Your instructions for the conversion of light to powder shall be followed to the letter. London shall have its own lantern when next the tide permits. Who, Watson, signs himself HM in communication with the Privy Council?" I started. "You cannot mean Her Majesty's Minister?" Holmes shook his head. "No, something older. The letter bears a watermark of the Admiralty, but the hand is foreign. Note the phrasing. Conversion of light to powder. It is alchemical in tone, the language of transformation. The initials, I believe, belong not to a man of government, but to a scientist. There is one who answers perfectly. Professor Heinrich Müller, late of the University of Leipzig, exiled after an explosion destroyed his laboratory in Shanghai. He vanished 5 years ago, and reappears, I suspect, under an English alias. He seized his coat. Come, Watson. There is one place in London where such a man might pursue his experiments unobserved. The old observatory at Greenwich, disused since the new one was built. If my reasoning is sound, we shall find the final embers of the lantern still smouldering there. The afternoon was grey and sullen as we crossed the river. A bitter wind swept through the streets, and the sky hung low, heavy with impending rain. At Greenwich the great park lay deserted, its autumn leaves sodden underfoot. Beyond it, upon the rise where once the old observatory had stood proud against the heavens, a single structure remained, a domed building with shuttered windows and a roof green with age. Holmes approached it in silence. The door, though locked, yielded readily to his pick. We entered. The air within was thick with the smell of chemicals and stale smoke. A workbench ran along one wall, cluttered with glass flasks, retorts and sheets of mathematical notation. But it was the object in the center of the room that drew the eye, a large spherical vessel of brass, fitted with pipes and valves, its seams glimmering faintly blue. Holmes bent over it, his expression grave. "A distillation chamber. The same residue. Do you see it?" Muller's hand beyond doubt. The lantern compound was perfected here. We moved cautiously through the chamber. In a corner by the cold hearth lay a pile of papers, half charred. Holmes knelt and turned them over. "Correspondence again. Listen to this fragment. To light the empire from within, the blue sun shall rise above the river." He looked up sharply. "Watson, do you hear that?" A faint hiss was issuing from the brass sphere. The blue gleam along its seams had grown brighter. "Back!" Holmes cried. "The valve! Someone's tampered with it!" Even as he spoke, the vessel shuddered, emitting a low, throbbing hum. A wisp of pale vapor curled from its joints. Holmes sprang forward, seizing a length of iron from the hearth. With a single blow, he struck the main valve loose, releasing a gout of white steam that filled the room. For an instant, the air itself seemed alight with faint blue fire. Then, with a sharp crack, the pressure subsided. Holmes staggered back, coughing, his face streaked with soot but triumphant. "A narrow escape," he gasped. "The inferno rekindled itself. Another hour and the whole observatory would have gone up like a torch." We flung open the doors and windows, letting the cold air rush in. The vapor dispersed slowly, leaving behind a faint phosphorescence upon the walls, as though the light refused to die. Holmes stood gazing at it for a long time. "The blue flame," he said softly, "so beautiful and so ruinous. A fitting emblem of those who worship power without conscience." He turned to me then, the tension gone from his face, replaced by a deep weariness. "It is over, Watson. The source is quenched. The lantern's fire will burn no more." That night, back in Baker Street, Holmes sat once more by the hearth, the last remnants of the blue residue sealed within a glass phial upon the mantel. "What will you do with it?" I asked. "Destroy it," he replied quietly. "Such light was never meant for man's use." He held the phial to the fire. The liquid within flared briefly, then vanished in a puff of pale smoke. "There," he said, "thus ends the blue inferno, and with it the last whisper of the river's secret." He leaned back, his eyes half closed. "Watson, promise me one thing. When you write this tale, do not let them call it merely another of our adventures. Say rather that it was a warning, that there are fires which, once kindled, consume not only the guilty but the innocent who stand too near." I promised him. And even now, as I set down these words years later, I can still see that faint blue glow upon the river in my dreams. A light neither holy nor hellish, but something between. The dying soul of London reflected in the dark waters of the Thames. Chapter 3. The Silent Tide. In all my years chronicling the adventures of my remarkable friend, I have seldom seen him look so worn as he did in the days that followed the blue inferno. Holmes had faced danger before with equanimity, bullets, poisons, even the threat of the gallows. But never had I seen in him this peculiar melancholy that settles only upon the mind which has looked too long into the abyss. The newspapers had hailed him once more as the saviour of London, the uncoverer of a plot that reached from the opium dens of Limehouse to the corridors of Westminster. Yet praise to Holmes was but dust on the wind. The river had burned blue, and the city was safe again, but I knew that some fragment of that eerie light still burned behind his grey eyes. He spent long hours at the window, gazing upon the rooftops of Baker Street, and beyond them to where the Thames wound unseen beneath the fog. The faint continuous sound of the city reached us, the clatter of carriages, the distant shouts of costermongers, but all seemed muted, as though London itself whispered under its breath. It was upon the third evening after the explosion that an unexpected visitor was shown up by Mrs. Hudson. He was a small, precise-looking man in a black travelling coat, his eyes bright and quick behind a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles. In his hand he carried a weather-stained portfolio. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he said, bowing slightly. "My name is Mr. Jonathan Quinn, clerk to the Admiralty, lately returned from Hong Kong. I believe I carry something that may concern you." Holmes motioned him to a chair. "Indeed, Mr. Quinn, you come at an opportune moment. The Admiralty's shadow has loomed over this case from the beginning. What have you to show me?" The little man laid the portfolio upon the table and drew from it a folded packet, sealed with the wax of the crown. "This," said he, "was found among the effects of the late Professor Heinrich Müller, whose laboratory in Hong Kong was closed after his unfortunate death by explosion. I was instructed to deliver it to the Foreign Office, but having read of your recent involvement with certain lanterns of a peculiar blue hue, I thought it prudent to consult you first." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Your discretion does you credit, sir." "May I?" "By all means." Holmes broke the seal and unfolded the packet. Inside was a single letter, written in a flowing German hand, and dated nearly 6 years earlier. It was addressed not to Sir Edmund Hale nor to any government department, but to A. Tregellis, Iskir, London. Holmes read it aloud. "The substance you request is no mere chemical, but an essence, the condensed breath of light itself. Treat it with reverence. The blue flame will illuminate not only darkness but corruption, for it reveals all that hides beneath the surface. When England is ready to face her reflection, ignite it upon the river, and she shall see herself as she is." Holmes read the words twice, then folded the letter carefully and replaced it upon the table. "So Müller was no mere scientist," I said quietly. "He was a fanatic." "Or a prophet," Holmes murmured. "That line, 'when England is ready to face her reflection,' it is the creed of the entire affair. The lantern was never meant for profit alone. It was conceived as a mirror, a purgation. To them, the flame was revelation." He rose and paced before the fire, his thin figure outlined against the flickering glow. "How blind we were, Watson. We thought we battled smugglers and politicians, but we fought men who sought to cleanse the empire by its own corruption, to scourge the serpent with its own venom." Mr. Quinn shifted uneasily. "Then it is true, Mr. Holmes. The lantern conspiracy reached as far as the Admiralty?" Holmes stopped and looked at him keenly. "Not only the Admiralty, sir. It reached into every heart that mistook secrecy for strength. The river carried their creed because it flows through every man who believes his sin unseen." Quinn's spectacles glinted in the firelight. "Then perhaps it is well the last of that light is gone." Holmes regarded him for a long moment. "Is it gone, Mr. Quinn?" he said softly, "or merely waiting for the next man who believes himself righteous enough to strike the match?" The clerk shivered. "I must return to my office, Mr. Holmes. You will know best what to do with the letter." When he had gone, Holmes stood motionless, the document in his hand. Then he fed it, seal and all, into the fire. The wax hissed. The flames turned briefly blue before fading to gold. "There," he said. "Thus end the last words of Professor Müller." We sat for some time in silence. At last I ventured to speak. "You are troubled still, Holmes." He smiled faintly. "Troubled, yes, but not defeated. This affair has reminded me of something I had half forgotten, that beneath all our triumphs lies the same abyss. I am, after all, but one man with a lantern of reason, and London is a labyrinth with no end." He took up his violin and began to play. Not the quick, restless improvisations of his more fevered moods, but a slow, haunting melody that seemed to echo the sighing of the tide. I watched him, the firelight reflected in his sharp profile, and for a moment I saw again the blue glow upon the water, the ghostly shimmer that had haunted our nights upon the river. When he laid the instrument aside, his voice was quiet, almost reflective. "There is something in that light that will not die, Watson. Call it human curiosity, or folly, or faith. Men will always seek to illuminate the darkness, even if it means burning themselves to ashes. Perhaps that is the truest reflection of all." He rose and crossed to the window. Outside the fog had lifted, and for the first time in many weeks the Thames shone clear beneath the moon. It flowed silent and vast, its dark surface unbroken save for the faint gleam of starlight. Holmes watched it a long while. "The river is at peace tonight," he said at last. "Let us hope it stays so." I joined him at the window. Together we looked out upon the sleeping city, its countless windows, glimmering faintly, like the scattered embers of some great fire slowly dying into memory. And as I turned to leave him, I thought I heard, carried faintly on the night breeze, the softest whisper of a chime. Not a summons this time, but a benediction. The river's farewell to those who had listened too long to its secrets. Chapter 14th. The River's Last Secret. It was in the early days of November when the final echo of the lantern affair returned to us from the river. The air had grown sharp with frost, and the fog that rolled nightly over the Thames was of that dense woolen sort which muffles the sound of one's own footsteps. Holmes, who had been engaged for several weeks upon a case of petty forgery in Wapping, was once again himself, keen, alert, and full of that peculiar vitality which to me has always seemed the very spark of his genius. "I have been reflecting, Watson," said he one morning as we sat before the fire, "that the river, for all its treachery, has a singular sense of balance. It swallows crimes as the sea swallows ships, but from time to time it gives one back." "You speak as though the Thames were alive," I observed. He smiled thinly. "Perhaps it is. I have met men less perceptive." Even as he spoke, there came a sharp rap at the door. Mrs. Hudson ushered in Inspector Lestrade, his coat still dripping with mist. His usually brisk manner was subdued. "Morning, Mr. Holmes," said he. "I've a matter on my hands that I thought you might like to see. They've brought a body out of the river, near Rotherhithe. Not one of the common drownings, either." Holmes rose at once, his eyes alight. "The river gives back, Watson. Shall we see what it remembers?" The body had been taken to a small police shed by the docks. When we arrived, the constables stepped aside respectfully. Upon a wooden table, beneath a damp tarpaulin, lay what the Thames had yielded, a man of middle years, his features distorted by water, but not beyond recognition. Holmes drew back the covering. "You observe, Watson." I nodded slowly. "The tattoo, an anchor entwined with a serpent. But this cannot be." "It is," Holmes said softly. "Samuel Blake, the watchman of Deadman's Wharf." I gasped. "Blake? But he helped us. He was the one who first brought the lantern to you." Holmes's face was grave. "Yes. The man who raised the alarm now returns to us drowned. How very consistent the river is." Lestrade shifted uneasily. "We found him tangled in the piles below the old wharf. No sign of struggle. Might be accident. Fell in the fog, perhaps." Holmes was already examining the hands. "No, Inspector. Look here. Skin beneath the nails, but no mud. And here, an abrasion upon the wrist, circular. The mark of a rope. He was bound and then freed when the cord rotted. Murder, and not recent." He leaned closer to the man's face, brushing aside the damp hair. "Do you see this, Watson? There, upon the temple, faint but unmistakable, was a small circular burn, a scar as if from a coin heated red hot." Holmes straightened slowly. "The lantern's mark." We returned to Baker Street in silence. Holmes, sunk in thought, did not speak until we had reached our sitting room once more. "Watson," he said, We have misread the final chapter. Blake did not die by mischance. He was silenced. By whom? The order was broken, its leaders dead. Holmes shook his head. So we believed. But recall what Quinn told us. That Mueller spoke of a revelation, of showing England her reflection. The flame was not an end, but a means. The true secret of the lantern was not in its trade, nor in its chemistry, but in its message. And Samuel Blake, poor fellow, had seen something that made him dangerous even to the dead. He crossed to the mantel and took down the small phial which had once held the last trace of the blue residue. It was now empty, clean, unremarkable. Someone came here, Watson, while we were at the docks. Mrs. Hudson admits no stranger, yet this phial was moved. The glass is warm. I felt a chill run through me. You think the river's servants still walk among us? I think, said Holmes quietly, that an idea once loosed cannot drown. The lantern was but a symbol, one that men of fervor will always rekindle. That night neither of us slept. Holmes sat long into the small hours, his pipe cold, his gaze fixed upon the dark window. Shortly before dawn he rose suddenly. Come, Watson, I must prove a theory. We made our way through the sleeping streets to the embankment. The tide was full, lapping softly at the stones. The lamps burned dim through the fog, each halo trembling like a candle behind frosted glass. Holmes stopped where the river curved past Deadman's Wharf. It was here it began, he murmured, and here it will end. He knelt by the parapet and produced from his pocket a small vial filled with a clear fluid. An experiment, he said. The formula of the lantern compound, purified and made inert. I obtained it from what remained at Greenwich. Observe. He uncorked the vial and poured a few drops into the river. For an instant nothing happened. Then, spreading outward from where the liquid touched, a faint shimmer appeared upon the surface, a ripple of light that glowed pale blue before fading entirely. Holmes watched it vanish. Beautiful, is it not? And harmless. The same light that once burned men's souls, now extinguished by clarity. Knowledge, Watson, is the only true antidote to fear. He turned away, his face softened by fatigue and a strange peace. The river will keep its silence now. In the days that followed, the city spoke of other matters, the approach of winter, the affairs of Parliament, the endless business of empire. The lantern affair was already passing into rumor, a ghost story told among the docks. Only Holmes and I knew how near that ghost had come to lighting all of London with its unholy glow. On the final evening before Christmas, I found my friend once more by the fire, his violin resting upon his knee. Outside, the bells of St. Mary-le-Strand were tolling softly through the snow. The river is quiet tonight, I said. Holmes nodded. Yes, but remember, Watson, the silence of the Thames is not forgetfulness, it is watchfulness. It listens still. He drew the bow across the strings, and a low haunting note filled the room. A melody like the ebbing tide, half sorrow, half serenity. And as the firelight flickered upon his face, I thought I saw for the briefest instant a reflection of blue upon the glass of the window, so faint, so fleeting, that I could not tell whether it was real or merely memory. Chapter 15. The Epilogue at Baker Street. There are certain nights in London when the city seems to sleep with one eye open. The lamps burn dim behind their veils of fog, the carriages move as though upon muffled wheels, and the river, that tireless artery of the great metropolis, murmurs in tones that seem almost human. It was upon such a night, some weeks after the affair of the lantern, that Sherlock Holmes at last laid aside the shadow which had hung over him since the first blue light had flickered on Deadman's Wharf. I found him seated before the fire at Baker Street, the violin upon his knee, the faintest curl of smoke rising from the pipe between his long fingers. The lines of fatigue that had lately deepened upon his face were softened, and his eyes, though thoughtful, had lost that haunted gleam which for days had marked him as a man still listening for some echo from the past. As I entered, he looked up with a faint smile. "Ah, Watson, You come like an emissary from the ordinary world, a rare thing in this house. Sit down, my dear fellow, and warm yourself. I have been revisiting our case from the beginning. You still ponder it? I asked, taking my accustomed chair. I do, he said quietly. Not for its complexity, though it was intricate enough, but for what it revealed. We are accustomed to confronting crime as a matter of greed, jealousy, revenge. But the lantern affair was of a different order. It was philosophy turned venomous. Its root was not evil, but conviction. And conviction, when untempered by conscience, is the most dangerous flame of all. He rose and crossed to the window, parting the curtains. Outside the snow fell softly through the gaslight, and the world seemed hushed, unreal. Consider them, Watson. Fenton, Hale, Tregellis, even poor Mad Hartley. Each began with a creed, however twisted, to purify, to reform, to illuminate. They kindled a flame, and that flame consumed them. It is the oldest tragedy known to man. I ventured, and yet you prevailed. Holmes's smile was thin. Did I? We doused the fire, yes, but the spark remains. Somewhere, even now, another mind is at work upon some theory of light, or justice, or salvation, that will end in ruin because it forgets that human nature is not to be remade by chemistry or creed. I have learned one thing only from this case, that intellect without humility is the lantern that burns blue. He turned from the window and returned to his chair. The firelight played upon his features, casting deep shadows under his eyes. Do you recall, Watson, that first morning when you read aloud the notice of the body found at Deadman's Wharf? I recall it well, I said. And your words? The river seldom yields corpses that have slit their own throats. You were right from the beginning. Holmes chuckled softly. Chance and experience, my friend. Nothing more. But I remember something else also, that you spoke of the fog as though it had a life of its own. You were nearer the truth than you knew. The river, the fog, the city. These are not inanimate things to me. They are the living body of London, and we, you and I, are but physicians called to treat its endless ailments. I could not help smiling. Then I fear your patient is incurable. Perhaps, he said, but it is a privilege to practice upon so vast a case-book. He leaned back, the faintest trace of amusement at the corner of his mouth. You have, no doubt, begun to set this adventure upon paper. Indeed, I replied, though I confess I scarcely know what to call it. The Blue Inferno, perhaps, or the Order of the Lantern. Holmes waved a languid hand. Neither. The newspapers will find their own melodrama. Call it, if you must, The Lantern on Deadman's Wharf. It was the wharf, after all, that set the scene, and the river that wrote the ending. As for me, I am merely its interpreter. The clock upon the mantel chimed the quarter hour. Mrs. Hudson's cat, bold from the warmth, had taken possession of the hearthrug. Holmes regarded it with mock gravity. There, Watson, he murmured, is wisdom we shall never equal. To sleep, untroubled, while the world turns. I laughed. A philosophy you might try yourself. One day, perhaps. He smiled faintly, then grew pensive once more. Do you know, my dear fellow, I sometimes think the river will outlive us both. It has seen London's sins and virtues alike, flowing indifferently past them all. When I am gone and you have written your last case, the Thames will still murmur in its old tongue, patient, secretive, eternal. Perhaps it will remember us kindly. He rose and held out his hand to me, an unusual gesture between us. Whatever history makes of me, Watson, let it not forget the man who made that history intelligible. My dear Holmes, I began, but he waved away my protest. Come now, said he lightly. This is no time for sentiment. Fetch your coat. There is a frost upon the river, and I should like to see it once before the thaw. We walked together through the sleeping streets of Marylebone, our breath rising in small ghosts of mist. The sky was clear, the stars bright as steel. When at last we reached the embankment, The Thames lay frozen at its edges, the ice catching the lamplight like shards of glass. Holmes stood looking out upon it, silent for a long time. Then he spoke, very softly as though to himself. "The river sleeps tonight. Its lanterns are dark. But somewhere in the hearts of men the blue light still stirs. Let us hope, Watson, that when it burns again it will be for knowledge, not for power." He turned to me with a rare gentleness in his expression. "Come, we have walked enough. London will keep her secrets a while longer." And together we returned to Baker Street, our footsteps echoing faintly in the stillness, while behind us the river flowed on, calm, inscrutable and eternal, its dark waters bearing away the last ashes of the lantern's flame. Chapter 15. The Light Beyond the Fog. It was several months after the conclusion of the lantern affair that I found myself once more seated in the familiar sitting room of Baker Street. The sharp bite of spring was in the air, and the scent of hyacinth drifted faintly from the window box that Mrs. Hudson tended with maternal devotion. Holmes sat opposite me, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his expression one of thoughtful repose. The newspapers had long since ceased to speak of the strange events upon the river. The Blue Inferno, as the Daily Telegraph had dubbed it, was already a matter of half-believed rumour. The city had turned its attention to the Boer question, a scandal in the banking world, and the first signs of an influenza outbreak in the East End. London, like the tide itself, has no memory. It merely flows ever onward. Yet for Holmes, the river's silence was not forgetfulness. It was aftermath. "Watson," said he suddenly, "do you recall my words that night by the embankment? That knowledge is the only true antidote to fear." "I do indeed," I replied. "They have stayed with me." He smiled faintly. "I find I must amend them. It is not knowledge alone that banishes fear. It is understanding. There is a difference. The one catalogues the world, the other forgives it." This uncharacteristic softness in his tone caught me off guard. I had never known my friend to speak of forgiveness in any form, least of all toward the wicked. I ventured to ask what had prompted such reflection. He rose and crossed to the mantel, where beneath a glass dome lay a small brass fragment, a warped piece of lantern casing recovered from the wreckage of the final explosion. Beneath it, in his careful hand, he had written upon a slip of card, "From the lantern on Deadman's Wharf. Extinguished." He lifted the dome and turned the fragment in the light. "It may interest you to know, Watson, that Lestrade sent word from the yard this morning. They have finally concluded their inquiries. The official verdict is simple: a conspiracy of smugglers, now destroyed." "And yet," I said, "you are not content with that." He shook his head. "No, because it is not true. The lantern was never truly about smuggling. It was about illumination, the dangerous illusion that light by its mere presence can cleanse darkness. Hartley, Hale, Tregellis, they believed they could purify corruption by unmasking it. But light without restraint is not purity, Watson. It is exposure. It blinds as surely as it reveals." He replaced the fragment and turned back toward me. "Have you ever stood upon the river at dawn when the first sun breaks through the fog?" "Often," I said. "It is London's one moment of beauty." "Ah," he murmured. "But have you noticed how the fog does not vanish? It merely turns to gold. That, my dear fellow, is the truth of human nature. We do not destroy our vices. We transmute them." At that moment Mrs. Hudson entered, announcing a visitor. "A gentleman from the Admiralty, sir." The man who entered was none other than Mr. Jonathan Quinn, the mild clerk who months before had brought us Muller's letter from Hong Kong. His manner was as crisp as ever, though I detected beneath his formality a certain unease. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, bowing slightly. "I come at the behest of the First Lord. There has been, well, let us call it a development." Holmes gestured him to a chair. "You will forgive me, Mr. Quinn, if I assume that the river once again is at the bottom of it." Quinn managed a thin smile. You assume correctly, sir. 2 nights ago, a patrol vessel near Tilbury sighted a drifting buoy, of unusual make. It emitted, so the men swear, a faint blue light. Holmes's expression did not change, but his eyes grew keen. Describe it. A small globe of glass, no larger than a melon, fashioned with brass fittings and sealed. The light within burned steady and cold. Not flame, but some chemical glow. The thing was inert by morning, and the substance within it had crystallized. Holmes's fingers tapped the arm of his chair. You have brought it with you? Quinn produced a small wooden case. Inside, upon a bed of cotton, lay the object, a perfect sphere of thick glass, its interior coated with a dull blue residue that glittered faintly when tilted toward the firelight. Holmes examined it closely. "This is not the lantern compound," he said at last. "It is a refinement. See here, the interior lined with mercury, the seal of modern workmanship. Someone has continued the experiment." "Continued?" Quinn repeated, startled. "But the men who—" "Are dead, yes," Holmes interrupted. "But ideas do not drown, Mr. Quinn. They merely find new vessels." He set the sphere upon the mantel and turned away. "This was not sent adrift by chance. It was a message, perhaps even a warning. Tell your superiors to examine the records of Muller's. Correspondence once more. There may be another name we have overlooked." Quinn rose, visibly shaken. "I shall do so at once. But tell me, Mr. Holmes, what does the message mean?" Holmes regarded the fading sphere, the ghost of blue upon the glass. "It means, Mr. Quinn, that the river remembers, and that somewhere in the restless machinery of empire, another mind has decided the world is too dark." After Quinn had gone, we sat long before the fire without speaking. The small globe upon the mantel caught the firelight and returned it with a subdued gleam. At last Holmes stirred. "Do not look so grave, Watson. The lantern is no longer a threat. It has become a parable." "A parable?" "Yes. Of how easily men mistake illumination for truth." He smiled faintly. "It will not be the last such tale, nor the first. We have seen enough to know that each generation must strike its own match against the dark." He reached for his violin and began to play, softly at first, a melody low and mournful, but growing gradually into something brighter, almost tender. The notes lingered in the air like ripples upon water. As he played, the last light of evening caught the glass sphere, and for a moment a faint reflection quivered upon the wall, a blue shimmer, delicate as a dream. Holmes saw it too, and his bow slowed until the sound faded into silence. "Do you see it, Watson?" he asked quietly. "I do," I said. "But it is only the fire's reflection." "Perhaps," said Holmes, setting down his bow. "Or perhaps it is the river reminding us that its story is never truly finished." He leaned back in his chair, the faintest trace of a smile upon his lips. "Come, my dear fellow, let us have tea. The light fades, but the fog endures. And so, I suspect, do we." And so ended the case of the lantern on Deadman's Wharf, a tale as strange as any I have ever set down. Yet even now, when the fog gathers thick along the embankment and the river moves unseen beneath the lamps, I sometimes fancy that a pale gleam trembles upon the tide. Neither flame nor reflection, but memory itself, the ghost of a light that once sought to purify the darkness, and instead became part of it. For in the end, as Holmes once told me, every lantern casts 2 shadows, one upon the ground, and one upon the soul.